Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. I remember the first time I walked through that alley at night. I had just finished a long shift at work and I felt drained. My back hurt from sitting in front of a computer all day and my eyes were tired from staring at the screen. I wanted to get home as fast as possible. The alley seemed like a shortcut that would shave 5 minutes off my commute. It looked harmless during the day, just a narrow path between two brick walls with a few trash cans on one side, but at night something about it felt off. I heard a faint sound like a whisper. I stopped and listened. It sounded like my name, barely audible. I shined my phone's flat flashlight down the alley, but I didn't see anything. I felt a slight chill run down my spine. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a cat. I walked home trying to ignore the shaky feeling in my legs the next day. I used the same alley around noon. There was nothing strange about it. Then I heard cars passing by on the nearby street. I saw a piece of cardboard leaning against the wall. There was a mild odor of garbage, but it wasn't overwhelming. The alley felt boring and ordinary. I even wondered if I had imagined the whisper. I shrugged it off and headed to work that night. I finished late again. I had an option to take a longer route, but I felt stubborn. I didn't believe in ghost stories or anything like that, so I walked toward the alley. Once I got there, I paused for a second. The streetlights around that area were dim, but they worked well enough to show me the entrance. The alley was dark, so I turned on my phone's flashlight. At first it was quiet. My footsteps echoed off the walls. Then, about halfway through, I heard the whisper again. It sounded like my name drawn out in a low tone. I tried to focus on where it came from. The sound seemed to bounce off the brick walls, making it impossible to pinpoint. I felt my breathing speed up. My hands got sweaty and I tried to hold the phone steady. I scanned from left to right. Nobody was there. I felt my heart pounding. I mumbled hello but didn't get a reply. I swallowed hard, then forced myself to keep walking. When I reached the other side, I looked back. The whisper had stopped for the rest of that week. I tried to ignore the alley, but it was too convenient to pass up. It cut a chunk of time off my walk home, and I hated long detours every night. Though the same thing happened, I would get to the alley, turn on my flashlight, and start walking a few steps in. I'd hear it my name in that same hushed, drawn-out voice. The alley was never fully dark because my phone's light bounced around the walls, but I couldn't see anyone. Sometimes I thought I saw a shadow shift, but I wasn't sure if it was my imagination. I'd stop to listen. I'd hold my breath, hoping to catch a clearer sound. All I ever heard was the whisper. I tried calling out again and again. No one ever answered me. I started to feel tense. Every time I came home at night, I'd feel my stomach tighten as I approached the alley. My shoulders would bunch up, my palms would get clammy, even my throat felt dry. I told myself it was just some weird trick of acoustics or an echo, but the tension didn't go away one evening. I decided to record it. I didn't have fancy equipment, just my phone, but I wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I waited until it was late, probably around 11 p.m. When there weren't many people on the street, I turned on the camera and started recording before I stepped into the alley. My heart was already beating faster than normal. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my chest felt tight as I walked. I held the phone out in front of me, shining the flashlight with one hand and recording video with the other. The night air felt cold on my face and my ears picked up every little sound. The hum of a distant car engine, the shuffle of a PL plastic bag on the ground, and then that soft voice. It whispered my name again. My skin broke out in goosebumps. I pointed my phone in the direction of the sound. I saw brick walls, some graffiti, and a bit of broken glass near the corner. No movement, no person. I stood still for about 30 seconds trying to catch more audio. The whisper came again, a little louder, but I still couldn't see anyone. My legs wanted to run, but I forced myself to stay. My mind was racing. I thought if someone's messing with me, they'd show themselves by now, but no one did. After a few more seconds, I hurried out of there. When I got to my apartment, I locked the door and immediately played back the video. I watched every second, turning up the volume to catch every detail. The whisper wasn't there. The sound that had creeped me out so much didn't show up at all in the recording. All I heard was my own breathing and the slight shuffle of my footsteps on the pavement. That realization made me feel uneasy. I sat on my couch, phone in hand, replaying the video. My mouth went dry and I felt my hand shake a bit. I couldn't understand why I heard something that the phone didn't pick up. I tried to see if maybe my finger had covered the microphone or if there was some glitch in the recording. Nothing seemed wrong. The audio was clear, just missing the whisper. I couldn't sleep well that night. I'd lie in bed and think about whether I was hallucinating or if there was some kind of trick happening. I woke up feeling groggy and tense. The next night I tried the alley again. I don't know why, maybe I felt a weird need to confront it. My heart rate spiked as I stood at the entrance. I felt a tightness in my chest, like I was about to do something dangerous. The lights around me flickered for a moment, which made me jump. I steadied myself, inhaled and stepped in my footsteps, echoed my flashlight, illuminated the ground and part of the wall. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of movement. I heard my name again, but it was faint. It came from behind me. I whipped around, shining the light at the bricks and trash cans. Nothing. I gritted my teeth and walked deeper into the alley. The voice came again, this time from my left side. I turned quickly, scanning the area. Still nothing. My breathing got rough. My throat felt tight and my hand shook a bit. The smell of damp concrete filled my nostrils. My heart pounded so hard I thought I could feel my pulse in my temples. Then the voice came from right in front of me, closer than ever. I took a step back. My skin felt cold and my mouth went dry. I raised my phone chin, shining the flashlight at eye level. Nobody was there. I heard nothing else, so I sprinted the rest of the way. I felt my muscles burn as I reached the main street. My chest heaved and I had to bend over to catch my breath. At this point, I was really disturbed. I started questioning everything about that alley. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank, but who would bother doing that every single night? Maybe there was a hidden speaker in the wall. That idea sounded silly, but I couldn't rule it out. I thought about telling someone at work, but I worried they'd think I was paranoid, so I kept it to myself. I just avoided the alley for a few days, taking the longer route home. That route was well lit and busy, so I felt safer, but I also felt frustrated. I didn't like feeling intimidated by a random piece of my neighborhood. After a while, I decided I'd go back and check the alley in daylight, then again at night to see if I could figure out what was happening on Saturday afternoon. I walked over there. The sun was bright. I saw some scattered trash on the ground. There was a broken bottle near a drain and a stack of empty boxes leaning against the left wall. The graffiti looked old. One section said something in big black letters, but I couldn't read the text clearly because it had been painted over by someone else. I walked the length of the alley, tapping on the walls to see if they were hollow. They felt solid. I didn't hear any strange echoes or whispers. It all seemed normal and mundane. I even stood there for a few minutes waiting, but nothing unusual happened. I left feeling a bit annoyed. That same night, I decided to pass through the alley again just to test. It was around 10 p.m. There weren't many people on the street, but a few cars drove by. I approached the alley and the hairs on my arm stood up immediately. The alley was dark except for a faint glow from a distant street light. I stepped inside, phone in hand, flashlight ready. The air felt colder than usual. My footsteps sounded louder. I walked slowly, scanning the walls, then I heard my name in that same faint whisper. My heart thumped against my ribcage. I clenched my jaw and kept walking, trying to pinpoint the source. The whisper came again. It sounded like it was right beside my ear. I felt a chill spread through my arms. I looked around, turning in a full circle. Nothing but bricks, trash cans, and a few old boxes. My forehead broke out in sweat. Even though the air felt cool, my pulse hammered in my ears. I kept moving forward. Each step felt heavy. Then I heard a soft shuffle behind me. I spun around, flashlight aimed. I saw a flicker of movement near the stack of boxes. I shouted, "Who's there?" My voice echoed off the walls. The The shuffle stopped. I inched closer. My heart was racing. I heard my name whispered again, right behind me. I turned so fast my phone almost slipped out of my hand. I aimed the light but saw only the alley entrance. My breath came in quick bursts. My throat felt tight. I backed away, keeping the flashlight pointed in front of me. I heard no more whispers, so I walked faster toward the other side. Once I reached the street, I broke into a jog all the way home. When I got inside my apartment, I locked the door and sank onto the couch. My hands were shaking, my legs felt weak. I wiped the sweat off my forehead. I stared at the floor for a good 10 minutes, just trying to calm down. I thought about calling the police, but what would I report that I heard whispers calling my name in an empty alley? They'd probably ask if I was feeling well or if I'd had anything to drink. I didn't want that. So I sat there feeling my pulse gradually slow down. My mind was full of questions, but I had no idea how to answer them. All I knew was that alley wasn't normal at night. It felt like something was there, hidden in the dark, calling to me over the next few days. I stayed away from the alley. I took the longer route. Even if it meant wasting extra time, I still felt uneasy. My sleep wasn't great. Sometimes I'd toss and turn, hearing that whisper in my mind, but at least I didn't have to experience it in person. After about a week, I tried walking by the alley entrance without going in. I looked down it for a few seconds. It was evening and the light was starting to fade. Nothing looked out of place. I didn't hear anything. I shook my head and kept walking down the regular path. I still don't have a solid explanation for what's happening in that alley. I've never seen any person hiding in there. I haven't found any speaker or device that could create that sound. But I know what I heard. It was real to me. For now, I stay away at night. I'd rather lose a few minutes on my commute than deal with that strange whisper again. I still think about it sometimes, sitting alone in my apartment or walking around my neighborhood. It's an unsettling feeling, knowing there's a spot near my own building where something unknown calls my name. I can't fully describe the fear it causes. It's not a monster or anything I can see, but something I can't explain. That's enough to keep me out of that alley once the sun goes down. I woke up that night drenched in sweat. My throat felt tight and my arms tingled with some kind of nervous energy. I had no reason to be awake at that hour, but I couldn't push away the sudden urge to check my garage. It made no sense. I live alone and I'm usually a heavy sleeper, but something was pulling me out of bed with a force I couldn't ignore. I sat up, grabbed a pair of sweatpants off the floor, and slipped on some old sneakers. I didn't bother with a shirt. The air felt cold against my chest, but I barely noticed. My only thought was that I needed to see what was going on in the garage. I walked down the hallway with slow steps, trying not to make noise. My heart thudded in my chest. I could hear the floor creak under my feet. The house was dark except for a little light from a street lamp creeping in through the windows. My ears felt sharp, like they were on high alert for any small sound. I reached the door that led to the garage and stood there for a second hand on the doorknob. I could feel my pulse in my fingers. I told myself I was just acting paranoid, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was waiting on the other side. I finally turned the knob and stepped into the garage. It smelled like motor oil and damp concrete. The overhead light switch was next to the door, so I reached out and flicked it on. The light flickered once before it settled. I scanned the place. Not sure what I expected to see. My car sat in its usual spot. A little dusty, the workbench along the sidewall looked normal. Tools where I had left them, a few empty soda cans on top. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. Then I saw the footprints. They were wet, dark tracks across the garage floor. They formed a trail that started near the garage's side door. That door is usually locked, and I almost never open it. The footprints moved in a direct line toward the driver's door of my car. Then they stopped just like that. There was no turning around, no continuation to the passenger side, and no exit path. It was like whoever left them had vanished into thin air. I stood there staring at those footprints, my mouth going dry. I felt my shoulders tense up my gut, twisted the hairs on my arms. Rose, I took a few steps closer, bending down to look at the tracks. They were shaped like bare feet, slightly larger than mine. There were toes and a clear heel. Mark each print was about half a step apart, as if someone had walked slowly or carefully. The wetness on the floor still glistened under the light. I could smell a faint hint of damp earth, but I couldn't place where it came from. I looked around, checking every corner of the garage behind the car under the workbench near the tool cabinet. I didn't see anybody, but I couldn't ignore the thick tension in the air. It felt like I wasn't alone. My body reacted as if someone was staring at me from a dark corner. My breathing was shallow and I could hear my own heartbeat. I kept telling myself to stay calm. I decided to check the garage's side door. I walked around the car, stepping carefully on the concrete floor. My footsteps echoed in the silence when I reached the door. I tested the handle. It was locked. I jiggled it a few times. It didn't budge. I crouched down and noticed the door frame looked untouched. No scratches, no signs of forced entry. I stood up again and tried to piece this together. If the footprints started here, how did someone enter without breaking the lock? I turned back toward the car. The footprints were still there, leading from this door to the driver's side and then stopping. I walked over to the car and peered inside through the window. The seats were empty, nothing on the floor mats. I tried the door handle, it was locked. I went around the car, checking the other doors all locked. I could see a thin layer of dust on the hood. If someone had touched the car recently, I would have seen smudges or streaks. There were none. My nerves were on edge. My mind kept racing with possibilities. Could it be some prank? Did a neighbor slip in here, somehow leave these prints and then slip out? But how the only other way out of the garage would be through the main garage door, and I always make sure it's shut tight. I looked up at the garage door. It was closed, just as I'd left it. I walked over and tried to lift it a few inches. It didn't move. I confirmed the lock was still in place. I listened for any sounds, breathing, shuffling, anything. The only noises were the distant hum of a refrigerator motor in the house and a soft, barely noticeable buzz from the overhead light. I felt a knot in my stomach. My hands were shaking a bit. Though I tried to steady them, I walked around the garage again, opening the tool cabinet, pushing aside old boxes, moving a spare tire. I found nothing. Everything looked the same as always. I stepped back and stood by the workbench, leaning on it for a second. My palms felt sweaty. My breath was short. I stared at the footprints, trying to figure out what they meant. They were so clear, so fresh. There was no reason for there to be wet footprints in my locked garage. It felt impossible. I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I'd report. There was no actual break-in that I could prove no damage, no stolen items, just footprints that appeared out of nowhere. I also felt a bit embarrassed about the thought of calling 911 over footprints, so I pulled out my phone and looked at the time. It was around 3:30 in the morning. I had this tight feeling in my chest, like I couldn't relax. I decided to check my car's trunk just to be sure nobody was hiding inside. I pressed the button on my key fob to unlock the trunk. The click echoed in the quiet space. I opened the trunk and shone my phone's flashlight inside. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a spare tire, a small toolbox, and a folded blanket. No sign of anyone. I closed it. The slam of the trunk lid made me jump. A bit, my heart was still pounding. I made sure the car was locked again and walked back to the door that led into the house. My instincts told me to keep looking, but I felt uneasy staying in that garage any longer. I double-checked the garage interior. I flicked the light switch off, then on again, just to see if the sudden darkness might reveal something. Nothing changed. The footprints remained. They didn't fade or lead anywhere else. I felt watched, but I couldn't see any eyes on me. My shoulders were tight and my jaw hurt from clenching it. My mind kept screaming that there was something wrong. I turned off the light and stepped back into the house, locking the door behind me. The hallway felt cold against my skin. I stood there for a moment, hands still on the doorknob. My breathing was shallow and my head felt light. I wondered if I should grab a weapon just in case. I'm not big on guns, but I do keep a baseball bat under my bed. I walked back to my bedroom and opened the closet. I grabbed the bat and held it for a second, testing its weight in my hands. It felt comforting in a basic way, like at least I had something if there was an intruder. I went through the house, flipping on lights as I moved the living room, the kitchen, the small guest room. Everything looked normal. The doors and windows were locked. I didn't see any more footprints. I didn't find any open windows. I listened for floor creaks or any sign of movement. Silence. Eventually, I circled back to the kitchen. My throat was so dry that I poured myself a glass of water. I drank it in one long gulp, trying to calm my nerves. I felt shaky, but I told myself I couldn't just ignore this. If someone had been in my garage, they could still be around. Maybe they ran off when they heard me. Maybe they were hiding outside. The thought sent a cold wave through my body. I decided to check outside the house, even though it made me nervous. I grabbed my keys, unlocked my back door, and stepped onto the patio. It was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlights on the other side of my fence. I held the bat in my right hand, keeping it close to my leg. The grass was a little wet, so my sneakers sank in slightly as I walked. I looked at the ground, trying to see if there were more footprints. I couldn't see any. The yard was still my air conditioning unit. Hummed quietly, I glanced around the fence line, shining my phone's flashlight. Nothing, no person lurking, no strange silhouettes, no movement. I felt a chill run down my arms, and I caught myself breathing fast. I forced myself to take a slow breath and keep looking. I checked the side gate. It was locked. I walked around the perimeter of the yard, searching for any signs of forced entry or disturbed soil. Everything was in order. I went back inside, locked the door, and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The house was quiet. My ears were almost ringing from the silence. I was wide awake, but I also felt exhausted. My muscles were tight, and my eyes felt strained from being on high alert. I returned to the hallway leading to the garage. The urge to look again tugged at me. I wasn't sure why, but I wanted to confirm that the footprints were still there, that I hadn't imagined them. So I unlocked the door and flicked on the garage light again. The footprints remained exactly the same. Wet impressions leading to the car door and ending. I swallowed hard. My stomach churned. I walked slowly up to them, stopping just before I might step on one. I was struck by how fresh they appeared. There was no dust settling over them, no sign that they were drying my mind. Tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe the concrete stayed damp for a while. Maybe there was some residue, but nothing made sense. The side door was locked, the garage door was locked, and no one was inside. I stood there for maybe a full minute just staring. Then I felt a wave of goosebumps spread across my arms. My chest tightened, and I sensed that presence again, like someone was watching me from just out of sight. I spun around, bat in hand, scanning the corners. Nobody was there. The corners were empty. My breath came in short bursts. My heart hammered in my ears. I decided I had enough. I backed up toward the house door, never turning my back completely on the garage. My hand felt sweaty against the bat handle. I reached for the light switch and turned it off, plunging the garage into darkness. My own reflection in the small window near the door startled me for a second. I pulled the door shut, locked it, and stood in the hallway again, trying to steady my breathing. My pulse still pounded. My skin felt clammy. I headed to the living room, flipped on a lamp, and sat on the couch. The room felt cramped, even though nothing had changed. I kept the bat close, resting it against my leg. My mind raced, replaying the scene in the garage. Wet footprints, locked doors, that intense feeling of being watched. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know if someone was messing with me or if something stranger was going on, but I knew I couldn't sleep. Not yet. I grabbed my phone again and considered calling the police, but what would I say? No. Break-in, no theft, no vandalism, just footprint. And a feeling I ended up staying there on the couch for hours every time the house settled. I twitched every time a tree branch tapped the window. My heart jumped. I kept the bat on my lap. My body stayed tense. My legs felt numb after a while. By the time the sun started coming up, I realized I had barely blinked my eyes. Stung, I got up, rubbed my arms to warm them, and walked over to the window. Dawn light began to filter in the yard, looked normal and calm. Eventually, I forced myself to check the garage again in daylight. I opened the door expecting the footprints to be gone or changed. Somehow they were still there, faintly damp, but starting to dry around the edges. It didn't make me feel any better. I stared at them for a long time, wishing I had an answer, but there was nothing obvious to explain them, so I closed the door and went back to the kitchen. I brewed some coffee. My body felt heavy and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. Even now I can't get that image out of my mind, those wet footprints that appeared from nowhere and ended right at my car door. No matter how much I try to think it through, I come up empty. I checked every lock, every window, every possible way someone could sneak in or out. It's all secure. I don't know if someone is playing a trick on me or if there's something else happening that I can't understand. All I know is I felt watched and those footprints were real. I still see them in my head whenever I close my eyes, and I still lock every door twice before going to bed. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, just like that first time, wondering if there are more footprints waiting somewhere in the dark. I haven't found any more so far, but I haven't stopped looking. I stepped out of my car and felt the heat hitting my face. Right away, my colleague had invited me to his farm for the weekend, and I agreed. Without thinking much about it, I wanted a change of scenery, and I was curious to see what kind of place he owned. I expected a calm spot with open fields, a few animals, and maybe a cozy house near a dirt road. I didn't expect to find a boarded-up wooden shed off to the side that made me feel uneasy the moment I saw it. My colleague Tom greeted me at the entrance. He wore a dusty cap and jeans with a rip at one knee. He shook my hand and pointed around, showing me the barn, the chicken co, and the house where I'd be staying. Everything looked normal. There were a few fences that needed repair, but nothing unusual. The main house had chipped paint and a porch with old chairs that creaked in the breeze. I felt comfortable enough until I noticed a smaller structure at the far edge of the property. It sat behind a patch of tall grass, and it seemed out of place. The walls were gray from weather damage, and the door looked slightly warped. I asked Tom about that building. He shrugged and said, "That's an old shed. Nobody uses it anymore. My uncle built it years ago to store firewood, but it's empty now." He sounded casual, and I didn't push the subject. He told me to settle in and said we could walk around later. He went back inside to make dinner. I stood on the porch for a minute staring at that shed. I wanted to see what was in there. I couldn't say why, it just pulled my attention after dropping my bag in the guest room. I walked across the yard. I passed by a few chickens pecking at the ground and saw the fence that separated the main property from the patch of grass. It wasn't a tall fence, so I climbed over it without much trouble. The grass almost reached my hips. It rustled when I moved. Each step created a low crunching sound. I looked back at the house. I didn't see Tom anywhere. When I got closer to the shed, I noticed there was a padlock on the door, but the latch was rusted. I tested it. It felt weak. I gave it a tug, and the lock popped right off the latch. I felt a jolt in my stomach. The door creaked open and stale air drifted out. I leaned forward to look inside. The interior was dim, but I could see the outline of some crates stacked along the walls. The floor was uneven. The walls looked dry and splintered. I couldn't see anything moving in there, so I took a step inside. Dust hung in the air. I smelled something burnt. I aimed my phone's flashlight at the center of the floor. There was a circle of black ash with bits of partially burned wood. It was recent. I saw a faint curl of smoke rising from the pile. It couldn't have been more than an hour old. That made no sense to me because Tom had said nobody used the shed. I crouched down and touched the ashes with the tip of my boot. They were still warm. I stood up, feeling my heart beat a little faster. I heard a noise behind me. It was a soft creak on the floorboards near the entrance. I spun around, holding my phone's light in that direction. There was no one there. The door was half open. The hinges groaned when a breeze pushed it. I felt a chill on my arms. I stepped over to the doorway and looked outside. The tall grass was still. I didn't see any movement. I scanned left and right. There was no sign of a person. I felt uneasy. My scalp tingled and I swallowed hard. I'm not the type to scare easily, but something about the silent yard made me feel cornered. There was no sound of birds or insects. The air felt heavy. I peered around the edge of the shed and saw only the outline of the house. In the distance, my phone vibrated in my hand and I almost jumped. It was Tom sending me a message that dinner would be ready. Soon I replied on my way and slipped my phone back into my pocket before I left. I took another look at the ashes. They looked like someone had been there recently. I didn't see footprints, but the floor was a rough plank surface, so footprints wouldn't be obvious. I brushed my hand against one of the crates in the corner. It felt empty, just a hollow sound when I tapped it. I didn't see any tools or personal items. Just that circle of ash. I decided to head back and ask Tom again about the shed. I climbed back over the fence and made my way to the main house. Tom was in the kitchen stirring a pot on the stove. I told him I went to look at the old shed. He gave me a curious look and asked if I saw anything interesting. I decided to be direct. I said there was a fresh fire in there. Any idea who might have started it? He stopped stirring, turned the burner off, and faced me. He scratched the back of his neck. He said he had no clue, and that maybe a farmhand used it for warmth, but he admitted that nobody he knew had any reason to be in that shed. He even seemed a bit unsettled, but he shrugged it off and changed the subject to dinner. We ate in silence for a while. He served a simple meal of rice beans and some cooked meat. I kept thinking about that pile of ash. I asked him again about anyone else on the property. He said there were a couple of workers who came by during the day to feed the animals and maintain the fields, but they left before sundown. He had no reason to suspect them of starting a fire in a random shed. His voice was calm, but he avoided looking me in the eye after dinner. Tom went to his room saying he wanted to rest. I paced around the living room, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was around 9 p.m. The house felt too quiet. I decided to take another look at the shed, this time with a flashlight. I grabbed a heavy jacket, slipped on my boots, and headed outside. The air was cooler now and the sky was clear. The moon gave enough light for me to see the outline of the land, but I kept my flashlight pointed ahead. I took the same path, passing the chicken coop and climbing the fence. The grass rustled around my legs. I stepped carefully, listening for any movement. The shed stood in the darkness, with the door still slightly ajar. I pushed it open and shone my flashlight inside. The ashes were there, but now they looked disturbed. Someone had scattered them around the pile. Wasn't as neat as before, and there were a few spots of dirt kicked into the center. My mouth went dry. I'd been gone for maybe 2 hours, and something had already changed. I walked in, scanning the corners with my flashlight. The crates were in the same place, but one of them was open. I stepped closer and saw that it was empty except for some straw. I heard a noise outside, like a twig snapping underfoot. I froze and turned off my flashlight. My heart pounded in my chest. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard another crack closer. This time I inched toward the door and peered outside. I saw movement near the fence. A figure ducked behind one of the fence posts. The shape looked like a full-grown adult. I couldn't see details, just a dark outline. My muscles tensed up. I stepped out of the shed, keeping my flashlight off. I slowly made my way across the grass, aiming for the fence on the other side of the property so I could loop around the grass, tugged at my pants, and each step felt like it made too much noise. I paused every few seconds, trying to catch any hint of movement. My ears strained. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears. Then I heard a swishing sound like someone pushing through tall grass. It came from my left, so I moved right. I tried not to breathe too loudly. I reached the fence and ducked behind an old trough that stood by some broken boards. My hands were shaking a bit. My throat felt tight. I stayed still for a moment, scanning the area. I saw the shape again, moving slowly across the yard, heading away from me. The figure was tall, wearing some kind of jacket or coat. I watched it slip through an opening in the fence near the back of the farm. It didn't make much noise, just a gentle rustle of grass. Then it disappeared. I waited another minute before turning on my flashlight. My mind raced with questions. Who was that person? Why were they in the shed? What was the purpose of that fire? I felt frustrated because Tom acted like he had no idea what was happening yet. There was someone sneaking around on his land. I worked my way back to the house, trying to stay quiet. I locked the door when I got inside. Tom's bedroom light was off, so either he was asleep or pretending to be. I considered waking him up, but I felt uncertain about how he'd react. Maybe he already knew something and didn't want to share it. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, thinking my heart rate finally slowed down. Sleep didn't come easily. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to every creak of the house. I heard the wind push against the windows. I heard the distant cluck of a chicken around midnight. I thought I heard a faint scraping sound at the back door, but I might have imagined it. I got up and checked. There was nothing there. The night dragged on, and I eventually dozed off sometime after 2 in the morning. When I woke up, the sun was already high. Tom was in the kitchen making coffee. I joined him, and he casually asked if I had slept well. I told him about the person I saw in the yard. He frowned and said, "That was strange." I asked if we should call the authorities or at least confront the farmhands. He shrugged and said we could walk around the fence line to see if we could find any footprints. I agreed. We walked the perimeter of the property, checking for signs of trespassing. We found a section of the fence behind the shed that looked loose, like someone had pushed it aside. There were a few flattened spots in the grass, but nothing else. We didn't find any belongings or tools. We didn't see footprints in the dirt, just scattered patches of dry grass. The ground was hard from lack of rain, so it was difficult to see any impressions. I asked Tom if he had enemies or if anyone local had a grudge against his family. He shook his head and said everyone around was friendly. He insisted the person I saw might have been a lost hiker or maybe a neighbor's farmhand cutting through. It didn't sound convincing to me. I thought about the fresh ashes. It wasn't just someone passing by. They had made a fire, then scattered it. Later, Tom acted casual for the rest of the morning. We fed the chickens, checked the garden, and fixed a broken fence post. I tried to get more information from him about the shed, but he kept saying it was just an old storage space. I felt like he was hiding something. He kept changing the subject to other chores by midday. I was exhausted. My nerves were on edge from the night before. I sat on the porch drinking water and watched the path to the shed. The sun beat down on the yard, and everything looked ordinary, except I couldn't shake that feeling of unease. I decided I would leave that evening. I didn't feel comfortable staying another night later before I started packing. I went to the shed one last time. It looked the same as before, except the door was shut and locked with a new metal latch. I tested it. It was secure. I crouched down and peered through a gap in the boards. I saw the crates inside. I couldn't see the ashes from that angle. Everything was still. The air around me felt thick. I turned and looked behind me. There was no one there, but I felt watched. I took a deep breath. Brian headed back to my car. Tom didn't try to stop me from leaving. He just waved goodbye and said we'd catch up later. I drove away feeling tense. My palms felt sweaty on the steering wheel. I kept thinking about that figure in the grass and the sound of footsteps on the shed floor. I couldn't explain any of it, and Tom didn't give me answers. Maybe he didn't have them. Maybe he just didn't want to talk. All I knew was that I left that farm with a tightness in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding in that old wooden shed, something that didn't want visitors. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror until the farm disappeared behind me. I felt relief when the road opened up to the main highway. I had a sense of escape, but my curiosity still nagged at me. There were fresh ashes, a locked shed, and footsteps that seemed to vanish. The entire experience stayed in my mind for days. I still wonder who was behind me in that shed and what they were doing. Maybe I'll never know, but I'm sure of one thing. Whatever was out there didn't want anyone else to find out, and I have no desire to go back and push my luck. I pulled up to that empty lot around dusk and parked near the old brick building. I didn't think it would be a big deal. The place was close to where I had a meeting the next day, and I figured it was better than hunting for a spot on a busy street. The building had shattered. Windows, some covered with wooden planks, and the walls were chipped. The lot itself was mostly gravel with patches of dried weeds and trash scattered around a faded chain-link fence, separated the lot from a narrow alley. I didn't see anyone around, and I didn't hear any movement inside the building. It looked abandoned. I locked the doors, took a quick glance at the building, and walked off. When I came back the next morning, I immediately noticed something on the driver's door. The sun was hitting my car from behind, so the side facing me was in shadow, but I could still see dark smudges on the metal. They were shaped like handprints. I stopped a few steps away and stared at them. They were smaller than my own hands. At first I thought maybe it was just some weird pattern left by the morning dew, or maybe some smeared dirt. I went close and put my palm up to compare. They definitely weren't as large as mine. They seemed too small to be from the average adult. I started checking around the car to see if there was any other damage. Everything else looked normal. No scratches on the paint, no dents, no broken windows. Only these odd handprints on the driver's side. The prints didn't look like a prank because I couldn't see any footprints nearby or any trail of dust that would explain how a person got close without leaving more marks. I glanced at the ground and kicked at the gravel, but it didn't reveal anything. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to overreact. I wiped the prints away with a cloth I kept in the trunk. They came off pretty easily, just looked like some oily residue. I shrugged it off, got in my car, and drove away all day. I kept thinking about those prints. My mind kept going back to how small they were. It was a little creepy, but I told myself it might have just been someone messing around. I had work to focus on, so I pushed it to the back of my mind. That afternoon, I went about my day, ran some errands, and eventually needed to park again because the vacant lot was free and convenient. I decided to do the same thing that evening. I tried to ignore the odd feeling in my gut telling me to find a different spot. I thought it was silly to avoid it just because of some weird marks. I parked around the same area near the fence. The building's windows were higher up from there, so I couldn't see inside. There was a slight breeze. I heard it rustling through the broken glass shards on the ground near the building. I noticed a light inside one of the second-floor windows, but it flickered out. After a few seconds, I told myself it might be a reflection from a passing car or maybe the city street light hitting a shard of glass. I tried to ignore it still. I looked around to see if there was any sign of people. Nothing. I leaned my seat back a bit, trying to shake off the weird sense that I was being watched. I waited a moment, then got out of the car, locked it, and left. I came back late that night around 10. The streetlights barely reached the middle of the lot, and my car was sitting in a dim corner. As soon as I got close, I saw the prints again. This time there were several, not just on the driver's door, but on the hood and the rear bumper. They were scattered in different positions, some slightly overlapping. All of them were small, like the ones from earlier. I felt my heart rate spike. My chest tightened and my mouth went dry. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone crouch behind the car. Nothing moved, no footsteps, no voices, just the low hum of distant traffic. My hands began to sweat, and I could feel a tightness in my shoulders. I took out my phone and used the flashlight to inspect the car more carefully. The handprints looked clear with individual finger outlines, but I couldn't see any sign of scratching. It was as if someone with greasy or dusty hands had touched it. The size and the shape made me uneasy. I tried to figure out if they could belong to a smaller adult, but they still looked too small for that. They weren't shaped like an animal's paw prints. That's for sure. They were definitely human-shaped. Just smaller than my own. I pulled an old bottle of water out of the back seat and splashed some on the hood. I used the same cloth from before to wipe down the prints. I pressed my fingers against them, hoping to smear them enough that they'd disappear. They came off, but I still felt like something was off. I couldn't stand there all night, so I drove home, annoyed and a little freaked out. The next day, I went to a car wash first thing in the morning. I had the employees do a full exterior detail. I waited in one of those little waiting areas with a cheap plastic chair and a coffee machine that spat out watery coffee. I kept checking my watch, feeling restless. I just wanted my car to look normal. When they finished, the paint was spotless. I looked it over from every angle, both sides, the hood, the roof, no sign of any weird prints. I felt relieved for a moment that evening. I actually considered parking somewhere else, but convenience won out again. I pulled into the lot just before sunset. I parked closer to the entrance this time under a streetlight so I could see around the car better. I got out and circled the car, checking every inch of it. It was still clean. Then I locked it and walked a few blocks to grab some dinner. By the time I came back, it was dark. The streetlight above my car was flickering in a slow, uneven pattern I remember feeling. A rush of frustration like the universe was messing with me. I took a deep breath and walked up to the driver's side, my eyes already scanning the doors. Sure enough, there they were again, 2 small handprints on the rear door's window, another faint one on the trunk near the taillight. I felt my stomach twist. My jaw clenched so hard I got a sudden headache. My skin prickled with goosebumps. I stared at the prints and I noticed they were a little smeared, as if whoever left them was in a hurry or pressed their hand at an angle. I looked around the lot, but everything was quiet. The building loomed overhead, dark. Windows reflecting the streetlights. I saw no movement. My mind raced with questions. Who keeps doing this? Why and how are they getting so close without anyone noticing? I had a sick feeling in my gut. The prints were too strange. They didn't match any adult hands. I'd seen they were so small that I felt a surge of nervous energy climb up my spine. I wanted to wipe them off immediately, but I also wanted to understand what was happening. I snapped a few pictures with my phone's flashlight on. The glare bounced off the shiny paint, but I managed to get a decent shot of one of the clearer prints. Then I wiped them off again. I drove home with my mind buzzing. My shoulders were tense and my grip on the steering wheel was tight. I kept checking the rear view mirror, expecting something to pop up behind me in the back seat, but of course it was empty when I got home. I parked in my driveway, which was well lit by my porch light. I got out and walked around to check. No new prints. I felt a bit more at ease that night. I didn't sleep well. I kept tossing and turning, thinking about the shape of those prints. They were so definite, so deliberate. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and paced around my living room. I looked out the window at my car in the driveway. It sat there silent and clean, nothing abnormal. Eventually, I dozed off on my couch the following day. I had an early appointment, so I left the house at first light. Everything seemed fine during the day. I didn't see any new prints, and I actually started to think maybe the issue was connected to that lot. Specifically, that made sense to me. I'd never seen the handprints in other places. Whatever was causing them had to be related to that old building or the area around it. I decided to avoid the place for a while. Later that afternoon, I got stuck in traffic on the way to meet a friend. By the time I found street parking near his building, I realized it was too far from his apartment and I'd have to walk. Then I spotted a gap in the line of parked cars closer to my destination. I pulled up and saw the no parking sign was half covered by graffiti. I didn't want to risk a ticket, so I looked around for other options. Finally, I recognized a side street that led back to the same vacant lot. It was the only place that still had open parking spots. My stomach knotted up. I sat there for a minute, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel. I decided to go for it, but I felt a sense of dread. As I turned onto that side street, I drove onto the gravel, hearing it crunch under my tires. I kept glancing at the old building. It didn't look any different. But the windows on the second floor still gave me an uneasy feeling. I parked, quickly shut off the engine, and stepped out. The wind was still, and the evening light made the broken windows look like empty eye sockets. I walked around my car one more time, took a breath, and headed off to meet my friend. By the time I returned, it was well past sunset. My friend had offered me a ride home, but I didn't want to leave my car unattended overnight in that lot. As I approached, the streetlights were dim. The corner near my car was almost in complete darkness. I felt a tightness in my chest again. My breathing got shallow. I clenched my fists a few times, trying to stay calm. I finally reached the car and flicked on my phone's flashlight on the passenger door. I saw multiple small handprints, maybe 4 or 5 in a cluster. They looked freshly made with clear outlines. My legs felt weak and my palms started to sweat. I heard a squeaking noise coming from behind me and I spun around, shining my light. It was just the fence swaying in a light breeze. I was alone in that lot. I moved closer to the prints and hovered my hand near one of them. Not touching it, but close enough to sense if it was wet. It felt cool and there was a faint smudge on my fingertip. When I lightly ran my finger across the surface, I wiped it on my jeans. I felt a spike of fear, like an electric jolt. I just wanted to get out of there. I unlocked the car, jumped in, and slammed the door. My heart was pounding as I turned. turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I half expected something to appear in the mirror or the back seat. Nothing did. I headed straight home, ignoring speed limits as much as I could without risking a ticket. Every bump in the road made me tense up. When I finally reached my driveway, I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My shoulders ached from how tense I was. I looked at the passenger door through the window, and in the glow of my porch light, I could see the faint smudges again. I got out and examined them. They were the same size, same shape. I grabbed a bucket from my garage, filled it with soapy water, and scrubbed the door. The prints faded, but I felt a strange sense of dread that they would appear again. Over the next couple of days, I avoided that lot altogether. I parked in paid garages in different streets, anywhere that wasn't near that building. I kept wiping my car down daily, even though no new prints appeared. After a while, I felt myself starting to relax, but then late one afternoon, as the sun was dipping behind my house, I glanced out the window at my car. I saw something on the trunk. I went outside, heart pounding, and found a fresh handprint. Same size, same shape. And I had never returned to that lot. The print looked damp, as if someone had just placed their hand there. My driveway was empty, and my neighborhood was usually quiet. Around that time, I couldn't find any footprints or signs of anyone around. I stood there feeling my skin prickle now. Every evening I check my car almost every time I find a new handprint. No matter how much I scrub or polish, they keep coming back. They always show up around sunset. They never appear anywhere else around my home. No windows, no doors, nothing, only on my car. I don't know who or what is leaving them, but the size of those hands keeps bothering me. I've tried installing a small security camera in my window, aiming it at the driveway. The recordings show my car sitting still, no one approaching, and then suddenly a new print shows up. It's like it appears out of thin air. I can't explain it, and I can't stop it. Now I live with that tension every day. Whenever I see the sky turning orange, I feel my heart beat faster. I wait to see where the new handprint will be. I don't know how to get rid of it. I can't talk to anyone about it without sounding crazy. I just keep washing and polishing, hoping that one day the prints will stop. So far, they never have. They show up as soon as the sun goes down, like some mark that I can't escape. And every time I see those small outlines, I feel a knot of dread in my stomach, reminding me of that old vacant lot in the ruined building next door. I knew I shouldn't have stayed after dark, but I showed up late and I had a job to do. That's how it started, me in an old mansion alone with my toolbox, convinced I could wrap things up without any hassle. I was wrong. As soon as I stepped inside that place, I felt off balance. The floors groaned under my boots, and the air, covered by graffiti. I didn't want to risk a ticket, so I looked around for other options. Finally, I recognized a side street that led back to the same vacant lot. It was the only place that still had open parking spots. My stomach knotted up. I sat there for a minute, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel. I decided to go for it, but I felt a sense of dread. As I turned onto that side street, I drove onto the gravel, hearing it crunch under my tires. I kept glancing at the old building. It didn't look any different, but the windows on the second floor still gave me an uneasy feeling. I parked quickly, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The wind was still, and the evening light made the broken windows look like empty eye sockets. I walked around my car one more time, took a breath, and headed off to meet my friend. By the time I returned, it was well past sunset. My friend had offered me a ride home, but I didn't want to leave my car unattended overnight in that lot. As I approached, the streetlights were dim. The corner near my car was almost in complete darkness. I felt a tightness in my chest again. My breathing got shallow. I clenched my fists a few times, trying to stay calm. I finally reached the car and flicked on my phone's flashlight on the passenger door. I saw multiple small handprints, maybe 4 or 5 in a cluster. They looked freshly made with clear outlines. My legs felt weak and my palms started to sweat. I heard a squeaking noise coming from behind me, and I spun around, shining my light. It was just the fence swaying in a light breeze. I was alone in that lot. I moved closer to the prints and hovered my hand near one of them, not touching it, but close enough to sense if it was wet. It felt cool, and there was a faint smudge on my fingertip when I lightly ran my finger across the surface. I wiped it on my jeans. I felt a spike of fear like an electric jolt. I just wanted to get out of there. I unlocked the car, jumped in, and slammed the door. My heart was pounding as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I half expected something to appear in the mirror or the back seat. Nothing did. I headed straight home, ignoring speed limits as much as I could without risking a ticket. Every bump in the road made me tense up. When I finally reached my driveway, I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My shoulders ached from how tense I was. I looked at the passenger door through the window, and in the glow of my porch light, I could see the faint smudges again. I got out and examined them. They were the same size, same shape. I grabbed a bucket from my garage, filled it with soapy water, and scrubbed the door. The prints faded, but I felt a strange sense of dread that they would appear again. Over the next couple of days, I avoided that lot altogether. I parked in paid garages in different streets, anywhere that wasn't near that building. I kept wiping my car down daily, even though no new prints appeared. After a while, I felt myself starting to relax, but then late one afternoon, as the sun was dipping behind my house, I glanced out the window at my car. I saw something on the trunk. I went outside, heart pounding, and found a fresh handprint, same size, same shape, and I had never returned to that lot. The print looked damp, as if someone had just placed their hand there. My driveway was empty, and my neighborhood was usually quiet. Around that time, I couldn't find any footprints or signs of anyone around. I stood there feeling my skin prickle. Now every evening, I check my car almost every time I find a new handprint, no matter how much I scrub or polish. They keep coming back. They always show up around sunset. They never appear anywhere else around my home. No windows, no doors, nothing, only on my car. I don't know who or what is leaving them, but the size of those hands keeps bothering me. I've tried installing a small security camera in my window, aiming it at the driveway. The recordings show my car sitting still, no one approaching, and then suddenly a new print shows up. It's like it appears out of thin air. I can't explain it, and I can't stop it. Now I live with that tension every day. Whenever I see the sky turning orange, I feel my heart beat faster. I wait to see where the new handprint will be. I don't know how to get rid of it. I can't talk to anyone about it. Without sounding crazy, I just keep washing and polishing, hoping that one day the prints will stop. So far, they never have. They show up as soon as the sun goes down, like some mark that I can't escape. And every time I see those small outlines, I feel a knot of dread in my stomach, reminding me of that old vacant lot in the ruined building next door. I knew I shouldn't have stayed after dark, but I showed up late and I had a job to do. That's how it started, me in an old mansion alone with my toolbox, convinced I could wrap things up without any hassle. I was wrong. As soon as I stepped inside that place, I felt off balance. The floors groaned under my boots in the air, but I heard another creak. My skin prickled. I realized it sounded like it was coming from the attic above the site. Manager never mentioned an attic, but I saw that there was a hatch at the end of the hallway. It was an old wooden panel in the ceiling with a cord to pull it down. I stared at it, not sure if I wanted to open it. I took a few steps closer. My hands felt clammy and I gripped the pry bar tight. Just in case I tugged the attic panel, it resisted at first, then popped open, releasing a gust of warmer, dustier air that blew right into my face. I coughed and stepped back. A small ladder folded down my flashlight beam, lit up the inside of the attic. It was cramped with a pitched roof and a few wooden beams. Nothing looked out of place at first glance. I called out again, "Hey, if someone's up there, I just want to finish my work. I'm not looking for trouble." No response. I decided not to climb up. I didn't see any reason to risk it. If there was a squatter or an animal, I didn't want to corner them. I figured I could call the site manager in the morning and mention it. But as I turned to walk away, I heard another squeak from directly above me. My chest tightened. I pointed the flashlight up again. I couldn't see anything. Maybe something was crouched behind the beams, or maybe it was just more settling noises. I stood there for a few seconds, breathing hard, and then I headed back down the hall. I went back downstairs, telling myself to stay calm. I wanted to finish the conduit in the main hallway, maybe check one or two spots in the living room, and then leave. I passed through the foyer and back to my tools. Everything was where I left it. I kneeled down and started running the conduit again, trying to keep my hands steady. The next 15 minutes were quiet, except for the usual creaks of the house. I was starting to think maybe I'd imagined the footsteps then. All at once, I heard a loud thump upstairs. It sounded like a door slamming. I dropped my screwdriver and stood up so fast my legs almost gave out. I shined my flashlight at the ceiling again as if I could see through it. My breathing sped up. I felt my heartbeat in my ears. I asked myself if I should go check, but my gut told me not to. Instead, I started gathering my tools. I threw them back into my toolbox in a rush. Every few seconds, I paused to listen. The footsteps were louder now, like someone was pacing back and forth across the floor directly above the foyer. I took my toolbox and walked toward the exit. I figured I could come back tomorrow with the rest of the crew, but I had one more thing to do. I had to confirm the main breaker was off in the basement. The manager told me the basement panel might be live. I didn't want any accidents. I groaned. I really didn't want to go down there, but I had to. I didn't want to be responsible for leaving something powered that could cause a short or start a fire. So I walked across the house to a door under the stairs that led to the basement. It was stuck. I put some force on it and it popped open with a snap. A puff of cold air hit me. The basement stairs were narrow and damp. My flashlight revealed stone walls with some leaks around the edges. I heard the drip of water. The steps were covered in a thin layer of dust and dirt. Every step I took made a dull thud. The air smelled stale like everything else in that house, but with a tinge of mold at the bottom of the stairs, I found the breaker panel. It was an old metal box with a new lock, but the lock was hanging open. I checked each breaker. They were all turned off. I flipped open the main switch compartment that was off, too satisfied. I closed it up, latched it, and turned around to go back upstairs. Then I noticed a small window near the ceiling. It was partly shattered, letting in a little bit of moonlight. Something brushed by outside a tree branch. Maybe it made a tapping sound against the glass. I shivered but tried to stay focused. I started climbing back up the stairs when I heard a scraping sound behind me, like something sliding across the basement floor. I spun around and aimed my flashlight. Nothing was there. My chest felt tight again. I hurried up the stairs. As I reached the door, I heard that scraping noise one more time. It was like a piece of wood getting dragged across concrete. I refused to look back. I yanked the door shut behind me and locked it. I didn't care if I wasn't supposed to lock it. I was done. I walked straight to the side entrance. The footsteps above me started again, louder and faster, as if they were following me from upstairs. I didn't stop. My hands were shaking and my pulse was racing. I pulled the side door open and stepped out onto the porch. The air outside felt fresher, even though it was chilly. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I slammed the door shut and twisted the knob to see if it locked. It did, kind of. The latch was loose, but I didn't bother checking it twice. I hurried to my truck toolbox in hand. The gravel crunched under my boots. I scanned the windows of the mansion. All of them were dark. One of the upstairs windows had a faint reflection from the moon, but I couldn't see anything inside. My chest was still tight and I wanted to leave as fast as possible. I threw my toolbox onto the passenger seat, got in, and fired up the engine. My hands were sweaty and I almost dropped the keys. Finally, the engine turned over. I backed out of the driveway with my headlight shining on the mansion's front porch. I felt a huge sense of relief as I rolled onto the main road. My heart was still throbbing and my shirt was sticking to my back. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the porch or at a window, but it was too dark to see anything. I kept my foot on the gas and tried to calm down the entire ride home. I kept thinking about those footsteps, that slamming door, the scraping noise in the basement. I wondered if the house was just creaking on its own, but something about it felt too deliberate. When I got home, I realized I was covered in dust and sweat. My arms were tense and my stomach felt knotted. I sat in my driveway for a minute, engine off, just breathing. I had trouble wrapping my head around what happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was all in my head, or maybe a stray animal in the attic. but that pacing upstairs and that slam still made my skin crawl. The memory of it felt too close, like it was still happening. I'm supposed to go back in the morning, but I'm dreading it. I'll have coworkers around then, which might make it easier. Still, I don't like how the place seemed to come alive the moment I was alone. I keep hearing the squeak of those floorboards in my head. The worst part is how it always came at the exact moment I tried to concentrate, as if telling me to leave. I got the hint loud and clear, and I'm not eager to ignore it. Looking back on that night, I'm sure I sounded ridiculous, calling out to an empty house, but I'd rather look silly than get caught off guard. I don't know if I'll ever feel comfortable working in that mansion. There's something about it that sets my teeth on edge. All I know is next time I'm showing up early and I'm not staying until after sundown. I don't care how much conduit I still have to install. If I hear even one footstep that shouldn't be there, I'm packing up and leaving. I'm not taking any chances again. When a house like that wants you out, it lets you know, and I'm not planning to argue with it. I moved into this old townhouse because the price was low and I thought it had a certain charm. The landlord said it had been around since the 1940s. I noticed the worn floors and the creaky stairs on the first day, but I didn't mind. It felt like a place with a lot of history. I had no idea what I was walking into. I had no idea I'd be standing in that bathroom every morning with my heart racing, worried about every little sound behind me. I'm going to tell you everything that happened step by step, exactly how I experienced it. When I first got the keys, I walked through the front door and immediately noticed a faint smell of old wood. The entry hall was narrow with a single overhead light that flickered now and then. I sat down my boxes in the living room and did a quick walkthrough of the house to get a feel for it. The upstairs bedrooms looked ordinary enough. The hallway had some chipped paint and the railing felt a little loose, but I didn't see anything too alarming. The bathroom caught my attention because of the old fixtures. The sink looked like it was from another era. The bathtub had those metal claw feet that I'd only ever seen in pictures on the first day. I didn't spend much time in there. I just looked around, noted the shower head was kind of rusty, and then went back to unpack. A couple of nights later, I was brushing my teeth before bed. I heard a rattling sound when I set my toothbrush on the sink. It seemed to come from behind the wall. It stopped after a second or two, so I shrugged it off. I assumed it was the pipe settling or maybe some rat scurrying around inside. I wasn't thrilled about the possibility of rodents, but I tried to ignore it. The next morning, I went into the bathroom again this time. I had my razor in hand because I needed to shave for work. That's when I noticed a small rectangular opening near the bottom of the wall behind the toilet. It wasn't big, maybe a few inches wide. It had a cover on it, but the cover looked old and a bit loose. I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't dropped my shaving cream on the floor and bent down to pick it up. My curiosity got the better of me, so I pried the cover off and peeked inside. I saw a handful of rusty old razor blades piled up. They looked ancient, as if they'd been sitting there for decades. Some still had little bits of old paper packaging clinging to them. I also noticed some scraps of paper with handwritten notes in what looked like faded black ink. The writing was almost impossible to read. Most of it had bled or faded into near illegibility. I held a piece up to the light and I could make out a few words like pain or maybe razor, but I couldn't be sure. My stomach felt tight as I kept looking at these dusty relics. There was a stale smell coming from that little hole, like old paper and metal mixed together. I placed everything back inside and closed the cover. I told myself I'd look at it more thoroughly some other time. Right then, I was already running late for work. I shaved and tried not to think about it, but while I was standing there shaving, I couldn't shake the weird feeling that someone stood right behind me. The bathroom mirror, an oval one attached to a medicine cabinet, gave me a clear view of the room. There was no one there, but I felt a cold sensation on my neck. The hair on my arm stood up. I finished shaving as quickly as I could and left. When I got home that evening, I went back into the bathroom. I wanted another look at those blades in the notes. I sat down on the edge of the tub and opened the little compartment again. This time I pulled everything out carefully. I laid the old blades and scraps of paper on the floor. I used the flashlight on my phone to examine the notes. One of them had a date 1956. Another one seemed to say something like, "I can't do this. Watch me." The ink was faded and patchy, so I could be reading it wrong, but the words gave me a chill. My heart started to pound in my chest. I felt a creeping anxiety, like I was uncovering something I wasn't supposed to see. My breathing got faster and my hands felt clammy. I stuffed the notes back in the hole, but I kept one of the blades out for a closer look. It had some manufacturer's mark on it. I squinted and saw that it read Gillette in old lettering. The edge was rusty and a bit of metal flaked off on my fingers. I put it back in the hole. I didn't know if these had some historic value or if they were just junk. I decided to leave them there and not throw them out. Something about them felt important, even if I didn't fully understand why that night I heard the pipes. Creak again. It was louder this time, almost like tapping. It came from the bathroom wall. I got out of bed and walked down the hall in the dark, my bare feet making the floorboard. Squeak. My heart pounded the whole way. When I reached the bathroom, I flipped on the light and saw nothing unusual. The sound had stopped. The little opening in the wall was still closed. Everything looked normal, except I felt that tight knot in my stomach again. Over the next few days, I kept noticing little things. The faucet in the bathroom sometimes dripped, even though I'd make sure to turn it off tightly. The door hinges squeaked at odd hours, as if someone was pushing the door open when I wasn't around. At one point, I walked past the bathroom door and thought I saw a flicker of movement in the mirror. It was so quick that I couldn't tell what it was. Maybe just my reflection at a strange angle. Still, it made me freeze in place. My legs felt weak and my breathing grew shallow. A week later, I woke up early on a Saturday morning to shave before meeting a friend. I stepped into the bathroom, clicked on the light, and stared at my reflection. My eyes looked tired from a rough night's sleep. I started to lather up my face with shaving cream. Then I heard a scratching sound from the wall behind the toilet. It was faint, but steady. My heart started to beat faster. I leaned over to listen more closely. The sound stopped the moment I moved closer. I stood there dripping shaving cream onto the floor, trying to make sense of it. After maybe 30 seconds of silence, I decided to ignore it and finish shaving as soon as I raised the razor to my face. There was a loud thud behind me. I spun around and the mirror bolted to the medicine cabinet, fell straight off the wall and clattered into the sink. Shaving cream splattered the mirror and it nearly shattered right there. I jumped back and let out a curse, my chest pounding so hard I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I checked the screws on the mirror. They were bent a little, but I could have sworn they were firm. The last time I looked, I ran my fingers over them. It felt like they'd been pulled loose. My hand shook and I dropped the mirror onto the countertop, nearly cracking the porcelain. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing and I felt sweat building up on my forehead. My thoughts were all over the place. I didn't want to assume anything supernatural, but I couldn't ignore how strange it was that the mirror just fell on its own. The entire time I felt like someone was close enough to touch my shoulder. I had to leave the house for a few hours. After that, I drove around the neighborhood, aimlessly looking for an open cafe. I got a coffee and sat there, trying to rationalize everything. Old houses have weird quirks, mirrors can get loose, old walls can make odd sounds. But I couldn't relax. My stomach churned and my neck felt stiff, like I'd slept wrong. I also noticed my jaw was tight, like I was clenching my teeth. I kept replaying that moment in my head. The image of the mirror falling out of nowhere later that afternoon. I forced myself to go back. I walked upstairs and took a good look at the bathroom wall. I tapped around to see if there were any hollow spots or rotting wood that might explain the mirror's sudden drop. The wall seemed solid. The little opening where the blades were kept looked unchanged. I pry it open again, hoping to see if something inside was pushing outward. The blades and notes were exactly how I left them. I took them all out and set them on a towel on the floor. This time I noticed one note had a sentence that looked like "they watch me." I'm not certain the ink was too faded, but I caught the words "they." And watch, my hands shook as I tried to focus on the writing. I felt like I was invading someone's privacy. Maybe someone who had lived here long ago. I put everything back after a minute because I couldn't stand the feeling. Nighttime was the worst. I'd try to sleep and I'd hear small scraping sounds from the bathroom one night around 2 a.m. I got up to use the toilet. I flipped on the bathroom light and my foot slipped on a small puddle of water on the tile floor. The faucet was dripping again, and the drip was much faster this time. I didn't remember leaving it on at all. My hand shook as I turned the knobs, and I felt a prickly sensation on the back of my neck. My reflection in the mirror looked pale, and my eyes were wide. I checked behind the shower curtain, even though I felt foolish doing it. The tub was empty, the shower had dripped a bit, but that was it. Everything else was normal except for that continuing sense of being watched. I started to dread shaving every morning, felt like a slow march into that bathroom where I'd stand at the sink, my eyes flicking from the mirror to the doorway, waiting for something to move or fall or break my hand. Sometimes trembled as I moved the razor across my face. More than once I nicked my skin and watched a thin line of blood trickle down my cheek. I'd quickly rinse it off and bandage it. Trying not to look at the opening in the wall, the landlord called a few times to check in, and I kept my complaints minimal. I just said there were some plumbing noises. I didn't mention the mirror or the razor blades or the notes. I didn't want to sound paranoid one day. I decided to document everything. I took photos of the opening, the blades, and the notes. I used a magnifying glass app on my phone to try to read the faded ink. I got a few more fragments of sentences. Don't let them, and waiting on the other side. My stomach sank when I saw that I kept checking behind me, making sure I was still alone in the bathroom. My mouth went dry and I realized I was breathing faster than normal. My heart thumped so loud that I could feel it in my chest every time I reattached the mirror to the medicine cabinet. I double-checked the screws. I tested. Their strength pulled on the mirror made sure it wouldn't come loose again, but twice more. I found the mirror off-center like someone had tugged on it one morning. It was hanging by one screw crooked. I twisted it back into place, but my hands were shaking. I could see sweat beading on my forehead. In the reflection by the second month, I could barely sleep. The bathroom felt more oppressive each day, each time I washed my face or brushed my teeth. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder. My reflection looked exhausted. My eyes had dark circles under them. I lost a few pounds because my appetite was off. I started eating just enough to keep me going. Some nights I heard footsteps in the hallway leading to the bathroom. I'd rush out of my bedroom, flick on the light, and find nothing but the empty hall. The old floorboards would still be creaking by the time I got there, like someone had just been standing there. My skin would tingle and I'd feel a cold sweat under my shirt. I never found a logical explanation for the razor blades or the notes. I never found a logical explanation for the mirror dropping. I tried searching for any record of the previous owners. I checked local records and found that the house had changed hands a few times, but nothing jumped out. As a big clue, no mention of anything violent or tragic. I didn't discover anything about who wrote those notes or why they stuffed old blades in that hole. The best guess I had was that it was some old practice from decades ago. Some people used to dispose of used razor blades through slots in the wall. The not notes, though, made no sense to me. They seemed personal, like someone's private scribbles of fear. I couldn't handle the tension forever. Eventually, I started shaving in the kitchen sink just to avoid the bathroom, but every once in a while I'd walk by the open bathroom door and feel that same chill. I'd hear a faint rattle behind the wall. I'd see the mirror slightly off tilt as if someone had moved it. My blood would run cold and my breathing would go shallow. I told myself it was just an old house with faulty hardware and weird acoustics, but deep down I felt a presence. I felt like someone or something stayed there watching every time I even thought about shaving in that bathroom. I still don't have any answers. All I know is I'll never look at an old townhouse the same way again. Something felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. The front door creaked and the old floorboards moaned under my shoes, but that wasn't what caught my attention. The pictures on the walls looked slightly crooked. I stared at one frame near the entrance. It seemed tilted just enough for me to notice like someone had moved it and tried to straighten it, but gave up halfway. My eyes moved to another picture further down the hallway. It had the same slant. I wondered if the place was settling or if there had been a minor earthquake. I took a few steps forward and felt a strange chill in the air. It made my stomach tighten. I approached the hostess station where a middle-aged woman with tired eyes greeted me. She spoke in a low voice and handed me a menu. She told me to choose any open table. Her tone was clipped like she wanted to get it over with. I looked around for a good spot. The restaurant was mostly empty. It was late evening and the lights were dim. I saw a booth near the back and decided it would give me a better view of the dining area. I wanted to see those walls to watch if anything else looked out of place. I settled into the booth. The vinyl seat squeaked under me. The menu was old and had stains on the edges. I glanced at the options. It was typical diner food, burgers, sandwiches, a few classic dishes. I wasn't really hungry, but I figured I should order something if I was going to sit there. A waitress came by. Her face set in a neutral expression. She gave me a quick nod. I ordered a coffee and a simple plate of roasted chicken with potatoes. While I waited, I looked around again. The lighting felt uneven, almost like certain corners of the place were darker than others. I could see a small bar area on the other side of the room. A few stools stood there, and behind the bar was a mirror lined with bottles. An older man, probably the manager, was standing behind the bar. He was cleaning glasses with a dish rag. He glanced at me a couple of times, but he didn't smile. I noticed the pictures on the walls. Once more, they were old photographs of the restaurant in its early days. Some years ago were black and white, showing groups of people from a different era sitting at these very tables. In one photo, I saw a row of men in suspenders standing behind a counter. The place had been around for over 100 years. That much was clear, but something about the way the frames were angled made me uneasy. They weren't off by much, but enough that I couldn't ignore it. When the waitress brought my coffee, I took a sip. It tasted slightly burnt. I asked her if the pictures on the walls always looked that way. She paused and eyed me for a moment. Then she shrugged and said, "Sometimes they move." Her voice was quiet. She didn't elaborate. I pressed her for details, but she looked away and said she had to check on something in the kitchen. I sat there tapping my foot on the floor. The place was silent except for the sound of the manager drying glasses and the occasional clatter of dishes from the kitchen. I tried to focus on my coffee, but my eyes kept drifting to the walls. I wondered if the frames were shaking slightly or if it was just a trick of the dim light. The manager walked out from behind the bar and approached my booth. He stood there for a moment, holding a glass in one hand and the rag in the other. He said, "We get small tremors sometimes, or maybe it's just the wind outside. They move around, but it's nothing to worry about." His tone sounded rehearsed, like he'd said the same line dozens of times. Then he added, "It's an old building, stuff happens," and he walked away. I felt a prickle of anxiety in my chest. It wasn't just the pictures. The entire place felt like it was holding its breath. I looked toward the kitchen door, which had a small rectangular window. I thought I saw a shadow pass by, but when I kept looking, nothing moved. My coffee was getting cold, but I barely sipped it. The waitress returned with my food. She placed the plate in front of me without a word. I tried a piece of the chicken. It was dry, and I wasn't in the mood to eat. My nerves were on edge. I forced down a few bites just to have something in my stomach. After a few minutes, I heard a scraping noise from the direction of the bar. I turned my head and saw two glasses sliding across the countertop by themselves. They moved a few inches before stopping. There was no one behind the bar, and there was no visible reason for the movement. My jaw tightened. I felt my hands grip the edge of the table. I glanced around to see if anyone else noticed. The manager was in the corner, pretending to focus on a shelf of liquor bottles. The waitress was in the kitchen again. I got up from the booth and walked over to the bar. The glasses were still there, right where they'd stopped. I looked at the surface of the bar, checking for spills or anything that might explain the movement. It was dry, no water, no obvious slope. The glasses looked normal. There was nothing special about them, but I knew what I saw. They slid at least 4 inches. I felt a knot in my throat. My hands were shaking a bit. I told myself to stay calm. I took a deep breath, then turned to the manager. He saw me looking at him, but he didn't move. I said, "What was that about?" He just shook his head. Then he muttered, "Sometimes happens." His tone was flat. He wasn't interested in discussing it further. I returned to my booth. My heart was beating faster. I tried to focus on eating, but I kept glancing at the bar. half expecting the glasses to start moving again. When the waitress came back, I asked her if weird things like that happened often. She shrugged and said, "Not all the time, but enough." Then she looked around, leaned in and said, "We don't talk about it much. Some customers freak out." She moved away again, not wanting to stay near me for long. I checked the time on my phone. It was only around 8 in the evening, but the place felt like it was locked in a strange twilight. The air seemed thick. I took a few deep breaths to steady myself. My stomach felt uneasy and my shoulders were tense. I forced down the rest of the chicken, but it tasted like cardboard. I finished my coffee. Even though it was cold, I decided I wanted more answers. I got up and approached the manager again. He was stacking some plates on a side counter. I asked him how long he'd worked there. He said over 20 years. I asked if he'd seen anything like that before. He gave me a quick nod but avoided eye contact. He said, "It's an old place. Things happen. Most customers don't notice. We don't try to scare anyone." His words sent a shiver through me. I asked if there was some kind of logical explanation, like unstable foundations or air pressure changes. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Could be. We had an inspector come by once." He said everything looked solid. Doors closed, fine floors or even. Didn't see anything wrong. Then he met my eyes for a moment and added, "I've seen a lot in my time here. I'm used to it." I wanted to press him further, but he turned away and started to wipe down the counter again. I heard the kitchen door swing open and the waitress emerged with a damp cloth. She began wiping a table near the window. I walked over to her, feeling a bit uneasy about confronting her again, but I needed more information. I asked how long she'd worked at the restaurant. She said about 6 months. Then I asked if it bothered her. She paused and looked at the crooked frames on the wall. She said at first, "Yeah, but what can I do? I need the job." She avoided looking at me when she spoke. Then she said, "It's not dangerous. At least not as far as I know." Something about her last comment made me more nervous. I asked if anything else happened besides the frames moving and the glasses sliding. She hesitated, then mumbled, "You hear things sometimes, footsteps when no one's walking around, doors opening or closing by themselves. It's not constant, but you notice if you spend enough time here, most of the staff just ignores it." I felt a tightness in my chest. I wondered what I was getting myself into. Part of me wanted to leave, but another part wanted to see if something else would happen. I stayed by the waitress for a few more seconds, but she clearly didn't want to talk. She returned to the kitchen, leaving me standing by an empty table. I walked around the dining area, checking out the photographs. I tried to see if there was some mechanical trick behind their movement, but I couldn't see anything obvious. They were just old frames with old nails in the wall. Some had slight angles, and others looked almost straight. I pressed my hand against one of them to see if it would move. It felt secure, though. A bit loose on the nail. As I let go, I heard a faint scraping sound from behind me. I spun around and saw a wooden chair move a few inches away from a table. My pulse raced. I felt my palms getting sweaty. I stared at the chair, waiting to see if it would move again. Nothing happened. The room was quiet. I reached out and nudged the chair back into place, but I felt uneasy. Touching it, my head felt hot and my stomach churned. I walked back to my booth and sat down. At this point, I didn't want to finish my meal. I checked my phone again. Only 10 minutes had passed since I'd last looked. It felt like an hour. I considered just throwing some cash on the table and walking out, but part of me wanted closure. I wanted some explanation. Even if it was a vague one, I waved the waitress over and asked for the check. She set it down without a word, and I thanked her quietly. I pulled out my wallet and placed enough money on the table to cover the bill and a tip. Then I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and walked toward the door before leaving. I glanced at the manager one last time. He was polishing the same spot on the bar over and over like he was lost in thought. He looked tired and resigned. I gave him a small nod, but he didn't react. I pushed the door open. Cold air hit my face outside. The sky was clear and the street was empty. I stepped onto the sidewalk and tried to calm my breathing. My hands still trembled. My legs felt stiff. I needed a moment to compose myself. Finally, I started walking back to my car, glancing over my shoulder at the restaurant's entrance. The sign above the door was faded and the windows were dark. I couldn't see inside anymore. In my mind, I replayed the images, the crooked frames, the sliding glasses, the chair that moved on its own. My entire body felt tense and my thoughts were jumbled. I told myself to focus on the present. I was outside. Now the cool air helped clear my head. I took a few deep breaths when I reached my car. I leaned against it for a second and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I had no answers. I only knew that the staff had accepted those events as part of their routine. They didn't seem scared, just worn down by it. I wondered how often they had to cover up or explain those things to customers. After a minute, I unlocked my car door and slid into the driver's seat. I gripped the steering wheel and stared at the restaurant in the rearview mirror. The building looked ordinary from the outside, but I knew I would never forget what I experienced inside. I started the engine and pulled away, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering unease. As I drove off, I kept glancing back until the restaurant disappeared from view. My body was still jittery. My pulse was still racing. I forced myself to focus on the road, shifting my attention to the traffic lights and the distant glow of the city. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I just stepped out of a place I should never have entered in the first place. And I still had no clear explanation for what happened in that old restaurant. It was just one of those nights I knew I wouldn't forget anytime soon. I knew something was off the moment. I compared the bedroom measurements to the official floor plan. The paperwork said one thing, but the walls told a different story. My main bedroom was supposed to be a bit wider. At first I thought the contractor had messed up, or maybe the walls were thicker than expected, but as soon as I ran my hand along the ceiling trim, my gut twisted. There was a slight hollow sound near one corner. It was almost imperceptible. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't talk to anyone about it right away. I wanted to see for myself. If there was a reason behind that discrepancy, I started by removing a small section of the ceiling trim close to the area that sounded hollow. I climbed up on a rickety old step stool that had been left behind by the previous owners. My chest felt tight. The idea of uncovering something hidden in my own home made my palms sweat. I took a small crowbar and wedged it under the trim. It resisted at first, but then it gave way with a crack. A thin layer of dust fell on my shoulders and I felt an odd shiver. My head was telling me to keep going, but my body felt tense. I pulled away more of the trim and realized there was some kind of sealed panel where I expected just solid plaster. The color was slightly off, like someone had tried to paint it to match the rest of the ceiling. My heart pounded as I pried the panel loose. It came down in chunks, leaving a gap large enough for me to see through. My mouth felt dry. I inhaled a mix of drywall dust and stale air. The space behind the panel looked dark, like a void that stretched beyond the normal boundaries of the bedroom. I grabbed a flashlight from my toolbox. I shined the light through the hole. The beam caught a glimpse of something wooden. It looked like the back of a chair. I blinked a few times, trying to make sense of it. Chairs don't just float behind a ceiling. I moved the flashlight around a bit more and saw the outline of a table and what might have been a sofa. All of it was covered in thick dust. The particles floated in the flashlight beam, making it hard to see clearly. I decided to enlarge the hole. My hand shook as I cut away more of the ceiling. I wanted to be systematic, so I used a utility knife and a small saw. The process took a while. At one point, my phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it. I felt like I was on the brink of some bizarre discovery. Every movement I made felt heavier than usual. My breath got shallow. I stopped a few times to wipe sweat from my forehead when I finally created an opening wide enough to fit through. I aimed the flashlight inside my stomach, tightened. There was an entire hidden room above my bedroom. The angle was awkward, but I could tell it was bigger than a simple storage attic. It looked like a small living space, complete with furniture. Arranged in a functional way, I saw a couch along one wall, a low coffee table in front of it, and a couple of chairs near what seemed to be a desk. The dust suggested it hadn't been officially used in a long time, but something about the arrangement looked recent. The chairs weren't pushed up against the walls like abandoned junk. They were angled as if people had been sitting there. I hesitated before climbing up. Part of me thought about calling someone, maybe the real or a friend, but I felt a strange pull, like I had to see it for myself first. So I hoisted myself up through the hole in the ceiling. My heart thumped against my ribs when my feet found solid flooring. I tried to steady my breathing. The air was stale, but it carried a faint smell. It wasn't mold or rot. It was more like old wood and a hint of something chemical, maybe varnish that never fully aired out. I swung the flashlight around dust SW world, making me cough. I walked slowly across the room, watching the floor for weak spots. My boots left clear tracks in the dust. I saw older footprints too, but they were hard to make out. They might have belonged to someone wearing smaller shoes, or maybe just a different tread. My shoulders felt tight. The idea that someone else had been up here more recently than the dust suggested made me uneasy. The furniture looked antique. There was an ornate wooden chair with carved legs, a coffee table with a glass top, and a heavy sofa with faded fabric. I ran my hand over the sofa's armrest. Dust clung to my fingers, but beneath the grime, the fabric felt surprisingly intact. I looked at the coffee table. A few old magazines lay there, their covers yellowed. The dates were from about 10 years ago. I picked one up, the pages stuck together a bit, but I could flip through. There were pictures of outdated electronics, no personal notes, no scribbles. It didn't tell me much. The tension in my chest grew stronger as I moved toward the desk in the corner. I placed the magazine back on the table and aimed the flashlight at the far side of the room. The desk was simple, with a single drawer. I heard a faint scraping sound when I stepped on a loose floorboard. My pulse quickened. I snapped my head around, shining the light behind me. Nothing moved. The only sound was my own breathing. I felt like I was being watched, even though I saw no one else there. My arms felt cold, even though I was sweating at the desk. I tried the drawer. It stuck, but a quick tug with both hands pulled it open inside. I found a few pens, a dried-up ink bottle, and some scraps of blank paper. No letters, no documents. I tapped the desk surface. It felt sturdy. The top had a few scratches and rings from cups or cans. Then I noticed something on the floor by my foot. It was a small thread of fabric, dark blue, wedged in a crack between the floorboards. It looked fresh, as if it had snagged off someone's clothing. My stomach lurched. The color wasn't faded. It was still bright, like it hadn't been there for long. I lifted my head and stared at the walls. They were made of plain wooden planks painted over in a dull off-white color. There was a single narrow window, but it was boarded up from the inside. I walked over and nudged the boards. They felt solid. There was no obvious way for someone to get in or out, not without prying them loose. First, my mind started racing, trying to figure out how someone could be in here recently, or why the furniture looked so used. My throat felt tight. I took a deep breath, but it didn't calm me. I walked around the perimeter of the room. My boots kicked up dust. I ran the flashlight beam over every surface, looking for any door or hatch. I saw nothing except the boarded window and the opening I'd come through. There was an old lamp in one corner, but no light bulb in it. The cord dangled uselessly. I tried to turn the lamp on out of habit, but of course nothing happened. There was a small trunk against the back wall. It had metal latches that looked rusted. I knelt in front of it. My knees creaked. I slipped my fingertips under one latch and tried to pop it open. It gave with a screech. The other latch was harder, but I managed to loosen it. Inside, there were a few blankets folded neatly. They smelled musty. I shook one out and coughed as dust filled the air beneath the blankets. I found some old clothes, button-down shirts, slacks. A sweater. All looked outdated, but they were neatly folded. I felt the fabric. It was stiff with age, but I didn't see any major discoloration or holes. Every looked preserved, but not completely abandoned. It unnerved me. Standing up, I looked around again, my mind buzzing with questions. Why hide a fully furnished room in the ceiling? Who maintained it? And what about the difference in measurements in the bedroom floor plan? I figured that was just part of the deception, a way to mask this extra space. My spine tingled whenever I thought about how recent some details felt. That single thread of fabric refused to leave my mind. I decided I'd had enough. My legs felt shaky, my lower back was tense. I started toward the opening I'd created. I pointed the flashlight at the ground so I wouldn't trip my own footprints in. The dust stood out, but every few feet I saw faint impressions of other footprints. They looked older, but not ancient. I tried to judge how big they were compared to mine. It was hard to tell in that low light, but they seemed narrower when I reached the gap. I switched off the flashlight and put it in my pocket. I climbed down slowly, feeling the edge of the cut ceiling pressing against my sides. Once I was back in the bedroom, I exhaled a long breath. I didn't realize I was holding. My heart still pounded, my fingers trembled a little. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. Dust covered my clothes and I felt lightheaded. I stayed there for a minute trying to process everything. The reality was simple. My new apartment had a hidden room complete with furniture, but the details made it more unsettling. The recent feel of the setup, the footprints, that piece of fabric. It all implied someone might have been using that space. I pictured someone creeping up there while the place was vacant, or maybe even during the open houses before the sale. I swallowed hard. My throat dry. Eventually, I forced myself to get up. I needed water, and I wanted to step outside. The closed windows and stale air made the bedroom feel suffocating. I walked out into the hallway. My shoes left dusty footprints on the clean floor. I wiped my face with my sleeve. My body felt clammy, and my stomach was in knots. I realized I had to decide what to do next. My first thought was to call the real estate agent, but I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding paranoid. Part of me just wanted to seal that opening back up and forget about it, but the thought of leaving that hidden room unchecked made my skin crawl. I stepped into the kitchen and ran the tap. The water was cold and I gulped it down. The sensation grounded me a bit. I rested my hands on the counter and took a few slow breaths. I noticed my reflection in the microwave black door. My face looked pale. My eyes seemed a bit wide. I didn't recognize my own expression. I felt like I just lived through an unsettling moment that I couldn't shrug off. I wandered back toward the bedroom. The silence in the apartment pressed in on me. The corridor lights were still turned off and the day sunlight was fading. The shadows felt heavier. My mind started replaying every step I took up in that hidden space. I remembered the angle of the furniture, the thick dust, and the footprints that weren't mine. My lips felt dry. I licked them and tried to steady my breathing again. I stopped right in front of the bedroom room door. I stared at the ceiling where I'd cut away the panel. A faint draft came through the opening. It smelled old and stale. I shivered. The idea of sleeping beneath that space made me uneasy. My arms felt goosebumps rising. I turned on the bedroom light, but it didn't make me feel better. The hole in the ceiling cast an odd shadow across the floor. My phone buzzed in my pocket again, but I still ignored it. I couldn't focus on anything except that room above of me. Finally, I grabbed my tools and began the process of covering the opening. My hands trembled as I lifted the spare drywall pieces and tried to wedge them back in place. I kept glancing up, half expecting to see someone staring down at me, but I saw nothing. Just the dusty edges of the hidden room. Each time I heard the rustle of drywall or the scrape of a tool, my heart jumped. I felt an urgent need to close it off, at least temporarily. Once I had a rough patch in place, I stepped back and rubbed my neck. My shirt clung to my back with sweat. I still had so many questions, but I couldn't handle staying under that hidden space any longer. The tension in my body felt overwhelming. I decided I'd call a contractor friend the next morning and get a second opinion. I also planned to speak with the real estate agent, though I had no idea how that conversation would go for now. I just wanted to get out of the apartment. I needed fresh air, and I wanted to clear my head. As I walked to the front door, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. Every sound seemed magnified. My pulse raced. I kept looking over my shoulder. I clenched my fists a few times, trying to get the blood flowing. When I finally opened the door and stepped into the hallway of the building, relief washed over me. The air outside the apartment felt cooler and cleaner. I could breathe again without my lungs feeling trapped. I locked the door behind me. My mind was still spinning, but at least I was away from that hidden room for the moment. I stood there in the hallway, dust still clinging to my clothes, my hair probably a mess. I had no idea what I just stumbled into. I just knew I couldn't ignore it. My next steps would involve confronting the people who sold me this apartment, but first I needed to calm down. My heart was still pounding and my thoughts were tangled. I walked toward the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I pressed the button. My body felt drained as I waited for the elevator doors to open. I caught myself glancing back at my apartment door. I felt that chill in my spine again. Then I looked away and forced myself to focus on the elevator display, counting down each floor. I just wanted to get out of there. The door slid open and I stepped inside. I tapped the button for the lobby. When the doors closed, I finally let out a long, shaky breath. My pulse throbbed in my temples. I stared at the elevator walls and tried to settle my nerves one floor at a time. I noticed the glow from half a block away. It was late and all the other buildings on that street were dark. This one still had a faint flickering light in the corridor visible through the glass doors. It didn't make sense because every rumor I'd heard said this building got shut down years ago. No one should have been inside, but the emergency lights told a different story. I felt an urge to check it out, maybe find a switch or a breaker that someone forgot. A small part of me also wanted to satisfy my curiosity. It felt odd and I couldn't let it go. I walked up to the main door. The metal handle looked dusty. I placed my hand on it and pushed it stuck for a second, then gave way with a creak. My pulse kicked up a notch. I glanced over my shoulder, wondering if anyone was watching me from the street, but everything outside stayed silent and empty. I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. A dull thud echoed in the lobby. The entrance smelled like old cardboard and stale air. There was a reception desk to my left, but it was bare. A few scattered business cards were spread across the surface. The overhead light was out, so the only illumination came from the emergency lights in the hall. I didn't see any sign of movement, but I got a nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. My chest felt tight and my stomach tensed. I tried to stay calm. I noticed a short corridor behind the desk. It led to a row of offices on one side. I saw a door marked maintenance. I figured if I wanted to figure out why the power was still on. That was my first stop. I walked past the reception area and pushed on the maintenance door. It was locked. I jiggled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. That's when one of the emergency lights in the corridor flickered. The sudden change in brightness caught me off guard. My breath got shallow and I paused. The lock didn't give it all. I checked my phone to see if I had reception, but it showed 0 bars. Typical, I thought. Old buildings like this sometimes had thick walls or some weird wiring that blocked signals. I turned back to the corridor and paused. Something didn't feel right. The air was stale, but I swore. I felt a cool draft run along the floor. It brushed against my ankles like a slow breeze. It shouldn't have been there. Not in a locked-up place, the corridor stretched ahead with several office doors on either side. The red glow of an exit sign at the far end gave me a little guidance. I decided to move forward and check each door, hoping one might be open or lead to an electrical panel. I reached the first door. It was unmarked. Just a blank wooden door with a standard knob. I reached out and turned the handle locked. The emergency light above my head flickered. The second my fingers touched the metal, I stepped back and stared at the flickering bulb. My heart pounded. I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe a bad connection. Still, my palms were sweaty. I wiped them on my jeans and kept moving. The second door had a small label. It said Office 1. Oh, 1. I tried it, same thing. Locked as I touched the knob. Another emergency light flickered farther down the corridor this time. That weird sense of being watched crept up on me again. My neck felt stiff, like I wanted to keep glancing behind me, but I forced myself to keep my eyes forward. I took a few more steps and noticed a single fluorescent bulb hanging at the end of the hall. It looked like a maintenance light. Not an official fixture it was on, but it kept buzzing and flickering. I could hear that electrical hum getting louder as I walked closer. Underneath that bulb was a door with a sign saying stairwell. I figured that might lead me to other floors, maybe a basement or a utility room. The second I rested my hand on the doorknob, the overhead light flickered 3 times fast. My stomach dropped and my throat went dry. It almost felt like something was warning me, but I wasn't about to turn back yet. I twisted the knob and it opened the door, made a slow squeak, loud enough to make my skin crawl inside the stairwell. The smell changed. It was damp, like mildew water stains ran down the concrete walls. A single red emergency light glowed above the first flight of stairs. I felt a little surge of relief, because I needed a new direction to explore if I wanted to find a breaker box. It was probably either in the basement or on the ground floor in a locked maintenance room. Since I couldn't get in there on this level, I thought maybe I'd find something upstairs. I started climbing. My boots echoed on the metal steps. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, steady but too fast for my comfort. It felt like every hair on my arm was standing up each step I took. I paused and listened. I was expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but I only heard the dull thump of my own. Still, I sensed something or someone around me. When I reached the next floor, I pushed open the stairwell door. This corridor looked similar to the first one, except the walls were peeling and the smell of old carpet was stronger. Another flickering light hung overhead, casting uneven shadows on the walls. I noticed 4 closed doors. A small waiting area sat to the right with a couple of torn chairs. The windows at the end of the hall were boarded up from the outside. No light came in from there. I went to the first door on the left. The label said conference room. I tried the knob, locked the light overhead, dimmed for a moment. My heart jerked. I glanced up, half expecting it to go out completely, but it steadied. I let out a breath and tested the door on the right side, which said storage. That one opened without a fight. I stepped inside. The storage room was cramped with dusty shelves and boxes stacked against the walls. A few old file cabinets sat near the back. The faint light from the corridor made long shadows inside. I ran my hand across one of the shelves and coughed as a cloud of dust rose up. I stayed quiet for a moment, waiting. No sounds came from outside. No footsteps. My heart was pounding so loud I could feel it in my chest. I opened a few boxes, found old office supplies, some binders, nothing important. I didn't see any electrical panels or anything that would explain why the building still had partial power. I left the storage room and tried the conference room door one more time, just in case it stayed locked. The next door said break room. That door was slightly ajar. I nudged it open with my foot. The inside was dark, but I made out a small kitchenette and a round table with a few chairs. I stepped inside and reached for a switch on the wall, but flipping it did nothing. No overhead light turned on. Then I noticed the humming of a fridge that stunned me. The building was supposed to be shut down, but this fridge was definitely running. I moved closer and touched it. The sides were cold and vibrating. I opened the door. The interior light was off, but I heard the motor humming. I saw a couple of empty water bottles on the shelf. I put my hand on them. They were cold. That meant the fridge had power and someone had been around or at least had used it. Not too long ago, I felt a rush of adrenaline. My throat was tight and I wanted to get out of there, but I also wanted answers. I shut the fridge, turned around, and saw the corridor lights flicker again. It wasn't just one light this time. The entire hall seemed to blink. My pulse raced the door, made a soft creak. It sounded like it moved on its own. I stepped back into the corridor and glanced around. No one was there, but I felt my skin crawl. I could hardly swallow. I headed back to the stairwell. Each door I passed gave me the same uneasy feeling, like something was behind it. The emergency lights overhead kept flickering in short bursts. When I got to the stairwell door, it was slightly open. I remembered closing it behind me. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. My hand shook when I reached for the knob. I pulled the door open wider, bracing myself for someone on the other side, but I saw nothing. Just the same dim red glow in the stairwell. I started moving up again. I wanted to check if the roof access or a higher floor might have the main breaker or a control panel. My boots felt heavier with each step. The air in the stairwell felt thicker, like the humidity was rising. I could see water dripping down the walls in some places, leaving dark streaks. A pipe somewhere behind the concrete might have been leaking when I reached the third floor. The lights in the stairwell flickered more intensely. I rested a hand on the railing, feeling the metal vibrate with every flicker. It was subtle, but it was there. I pushed the door open. It resisted a bit, almost like someone was on the other side, but it gave way. After a second, this floor's hallway was darker. Only one emergency light worked, and it was near the far end. The doors here looked the same as below, but they were spaced farther apart. I guess these might have been larger offices. My eyes locked onto a metal door at the end of the corridor that looked heavier and more reinforced than the others. I had a hunch it might lead to a utility room or something related to building maintenance. As I approached the single working emergency light flickered. My muscles felt tense and my nerves were on edge, but I couldn't turn around. Now I had to see what was behind that door. My hand was shaking as I gripped the knob. It didn't turn. The door was locked. I saw a small keypad on the wall next to it, but no power light on the keypad. I pushed the door anyway. Nothing. I tried pulling it. Stayed shut. Then the light above me flickered again more rapidly and the corridor dimmed for a second. I let go of the knob and stepped back. My mouth felt dry and my head started to ache from the tension. A noise behind me made me freeze. It sounded like a single footstep on the hard floor. I spun around, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. The corridor was empty. My ears were ringing. I took a slow breath to steady myself, then decided I'd had enough. If there was any explanation for the power still being on, it had to be behind that locked door or in some hidden fuse box. But I wasn't going to find it that night. My gut told me to leave. I returned to the stairwell, moving faster than before. My ears were buzzing with anxiety. It felt like something was right behind me, breathing down my neck. My heart felt like it was in my throat. When I reached the ground floor, the corridor light flickered again, almost like it was trying to chase me out. I took the hint I made of the beeline for the entrance, passing the empty reception desk. The outside light was still non-existent, but the faint glow from the parking lot street lamp gave me a target. I reached the door and shoved it open. A rush of cool night air hit me, a relief. After the stale, heavy air inside, I stepped onto the sidewalk, breathing hard. My hands were shaking and my legs felt weak. I turned around to look at the building. One last time, the corridor light inside was still flickering, casting rhythmic flashes on the glass doors. I felt certain someone was in there or something was keeping the place barely alive, but I wasn't about to go back in for a second round. I pulled out my phone and checked for service. I still had no signal. I walked a few blocks away until my phone finally picked up a single bar. I stopped, stared back at the outline of the old commercial building, then headed home. I haven't been back since. I keep telling myself I should let somebody else worry about that broken breaker or that open fridge. It's not my responsibility. Yet a part of me still wonders if there's some caretaker or guard who's never officially left, or maybe it's just an abandoned building with faulty wiring that flickers for no real reason. All I know is every time I think about that place, my spine tingles and my stomach knots up. I remember the way the light seemed to react to my steps, almost like they were telling me to stay out and maybe next time I'll listen. I first heard the tapping on my second night in the house. It was around midnight. I was sitting on the couch in the living room reading through my phone messages when I felt a slight vibration through the floor. At first I thought it was a distant neighbor or a car passing by. Then I heard a faint knock beneath me. It felt deliberate. I stood up and walked around trying to figure out where it was coming from. I pressed my ear to the floorboards near the center of the room and I heard it again. 2 knocks spaced a few seconds apart. I straightened up, trying to ignore the chill running through my arms. The house was a single-story rental in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing about it seemed unusual when I toured it. The landlord was a calm woman who only mentioned that the house had a small subfloor. She showed me an old Aleppo in the hallway. She said it led to a space that was sometimes used for storage. I didn't pay much attention, but I remembered where she pointed it out. Now I was wondering if something below the floor might be banging against the underside of the boards. I walked to the hallway and flipped on the light. I crouched down and pulled on the small handle for the subfloor hatch. I hesitated, but the sound had me on edge. I wanted to check if there was some animal down there. I lifted the hatch and looked inside. A bit of dust flew up and the smoke smell of old stagnant air hit my nose. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and pointed the beam into the darkness. I saw a short ladder leading down to a narrow space. The ground below looked uneven and covered in loose dirt. There were a few cobwebs and nothing else. No sign of movement, no boxes, no footprints. I listened, but everything was silent. I took a few deep breaths, then carefully climbed down the flashlight, illuminated thick dust in the air. I looked around, checking the corners. It felt cramped. The floor was a few feet below the beams, leaving only enough space to crouch. I moved along, each corner touching the walls to see if they were stable. The walls were made of old concrete blocks. There was no sign of an animal. Nest, no pipes banging, no dripping water. Everything seemed abandoned after a few minutes. I climbed back up, closed the hatch, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. That night, the tapping started again. It was around the same time, maybe a bit later. I was in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard that low thud again. It came from somewhere beneath the bedroom. This time it was a slow, repetitive tapping. I sat up and listened. My heart picked up speed. I turned on the lamp and walked around the bedroom, pressing my foot into the carpet, hoping to feel some movement. It was just solid floor beneath me. The tapping stopped for a while, so I went back to bed, but I had trouble sleeping. I kept waiting for the next knock over the following nights. The tapping continued. It moved from one area of the house to another. Sometimes it was near the living room couch, sometimes near the kitchen table, sometimes near the hallway. I couldn't find a single spot that made sense. It always happened late at night, sometimes for only a minute, sometimes for longer. One evening it started at around 1 in the morning. I got out of bed feeling a jolt of nerves in my stomach. My neck felt tense and my breathing quickened. I grabbed the flashlight again, but I didn't go down to the subfloor instead. I pressed my ear against the floor in the hallway. I heard what sounded like slow, careful knocks. They were spaced in a pattern of 3. Knock, knock, knock. A pause. Then it repeated. I grabbed my phone and recorded the sound for a minute. My hands were shaking and I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I had no idea what to do. I wasn't sure if I should call someone or just ignore it. The landlord never mentioned anything like this. I decided to send a message to a friend who lived nearby asking if I could call him the next day. I didn't go back to sleep easily. I kept hearing faint sounds, and every time my eyes closed, I felt a jolt of fear. The next day I showed my friend the recording. He looked at me and shrugged. He said it might be pipes or an old foundation settling. He suggested checking around the exterior of the house. Maybe there was a loose panel or some tree root pushing against the foundation. I took his advice and walked around the outside of the house. That afternoon the walls looked intact. The ground was dry and flat. I didn't see any holes or cracks. I noticed a few old vents along the base of the house, but they seemed clogged with dirt and spider webs. Nothing jumped out at me that night. I decided to stay up late and keep the lights on. I set up a small camping chair in the living room facing the hallway because that was where I heard the loudest tapping. I had my phone ready to record. I waited until midnight, then 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. By 2:30 I was half asleep. My eyes were heavy and I was struggling to keep them open. Right when I considered giving up, I heard a steady knock from underneath the living room floor. My chest felt tight. I forced myself to stay calm. I pressed record on my phone again. I listened as the knocking formed short bursts like it was delivering a simple code. The hair on my arm stood up. I couldn't tell if it was random or if it had a pattern, but it sounded too consistent to be random. I waited it out for a few minutes until it stopped completely. The next morning I replayed the recording. The taps were clear and separated by almost the same interval. Every time I felt uneasy, I considered contacting a professional to check the foundation, but I also worried they would think I was hearing things. I decided to investigate the subfloor again. This time in the daylight, I opened the hatch, climbed down, and tried to see if there were any sections of the subfloor that looked hollow or replaced. I tapped on each beam and each port. Everything seemed solid. I crawled around, coughing at the dust. I found a few old nails and a piece of cardboard, but nothing else. The space was empty. My frustration grew. That afternoon, I went to a hardware store and bought a small camera that could be mounted on a rod. It was the kind people use for plumbing inspections. I thought maybe there was a hidden space beneath the dirt. I spent a few hours jabbing it into the ground in different spots. Moving the camera around the feet on my phone showed nothing but dirt cobwebs and the same concrete walls. I felt sweat dripping down my neck as I worked. It was hot down there and the air felt stale, but I didn't see anything that would cause knocking. After I finished, I sealed the hatch. Again. The knocks came back that night. They were louder. They happened around 1 in the morning, then again at 2, then again at 3. They were slow measured T-caps, each set lasting about half a minute. My heart pounded each time I sat up in bed. My mind racing, I checked under the bed and the closet behind the door. Even though I knew the sounds were coming from the floor, I couldn't rest. By the time morning came, my body felt exhausted. My eyes burned. My muscles were tense. I called my landlord that morning. I told her about the noises. She sounded surprised and said she had never heard of anything like that happening in the house. She offered to come by and listen. That evening, she showed up around 600. We walked through every room. She looked at the subfloor hatch. She admitted she had never gone down there herself, but she said the previous tenants never reported anything unusual. We waited until about 10 o'clock, but nothing happened. No knocks, no vibrations. Eventually, she left. The house felt quiet again, and I felt anxious because I knew the knocking would probably return once I was alone. I was right around midnight. I heard it again this time. Closer than before, the living room floor shook slightly with each knock. I turned on every light in the house and walked around with my phone recording. My legs felt weak. My mouth was dry. I stood in the hallway listening to the knocks. They paused, then started again. I climbed down to the subfloor with my phone flashlight on, trying to catch it. From below, I half expected to see a person crouching in the darkness, but there was no one there. The knocks continued above me, right over my head. I waved my phone light around, searching for any sign of movement in the beams or the boards. Nothing, just the same dusty space. I decided to speak out loud. I shouted, asking if someone was there. Even though it felt ridiculous, the knocking stopped. My chest tightened. I stood still, breathing hard, staring at the floor above me. The silence weighed on me after maybe a minute. I climbed back up. I felt shaken. I sat on the edge of my couch, my mind spinning. I felt a dull ache in my temples. My palms were sweaty. I locked every door and window. My heart was thumping. And I felt a strange need to keep the lights on for the rest of the night. The next days became a pattern. The knock returned every night. They got more rhythmic, sometimes in sets of 3, sometimes in sets of 4. I tried to record them every time. When I played them back, they were always clear, but I couldn't figure out a pattern. I tried researching old houses with subfloors, reading about foundation issues, animals in the walls, plumbing knocks, and everything else. Nothing matched the sounds I was hearing. I brought my friend back to the house and showed him the recordings. He listened with a serious look on his face. We stayed up that night, both of us in the living room. The knocking happened around 1:15 a.m. He heard it. His eyes went wide and he quickly got up to check the hallway. He listened against the floor, shook his head, and whispered that it sounded like someone tapping from below. I suggested we both go into the subfloor. He agreed and we climbed down together. We aimed our flashlights at the boards above us. The knocking continued. It was right above us, but there was nothing there. We stood still, feeling the vibrations through the wood. He looked at me with a tense expression. I felt my stomach tighten. We stayed until it stopped. Then we climbed back out without saying much. He left around sunrise. Neither of us had an explanation. He told me he didn't think it was a prank. We didn't see any sign that someone could get under there without the hatch. There was no entrance from outside. We checked for hidden doors or new openings, but we found nothing. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? There was no intruder, no visible damage, just persistent knocks by the next week. I was sleeping maybe 2 hours a night. The knocks came almost every night. Sometimes they lasted for 10 minutes, sometimes longer. Sometimes they paused for half an hour and then started again. I felt run down my head, HD, constantly. My hands shook from lack of rest. My heart jumped at every little sound. Even during the day, I tried turning the TV up wearing headphones. Even staying at a motel for a night when I returned, the knock continued. I kept thinking there had to be a logical reason something was causing the vibrations. Something was hitting the bottom of the floorboards, but I never found any evidence of hardware issues or pests or anything that moved the beams. The landlord was as confused as I was. She suggested I might want to move out if it was that disruptive, but I didn't have enough money to break the lease. I felt stuck. The knocks are still happening last night. They started around midnight, then returned at 2 a.m., then again at 3 a.m. I stood in the hallway staring at the floor, my pulse racing. I felt heat in my cheeks. Every time the knocking started, I felt my body tense. I tried hitting the floor back, thinking it might scare off whatever was down there. When I did that, the knocking stopped for a few seconds, then started again. It was slow, like a response. I shouted at it to stop it. Didn't. I'm at the point where I'm considering ripping up the floorboards to see if there's something hidden beneath them. I don't see another option. I can't sleep and I can't relax. I don't have an answer for why this keeps happening. I've tried everything else I can think of tonight. I might take a crowbar and pry up a section of the floor in the hallway. I don't know what I'll find. Maybe it'll just be the same dirt and dust. Maybe there's some unknown hole or an old pipe. I just need to know. I'm not sure if I'll have the guts to do it alone, but I don't see another choice. All I know is that the knocks keep coming and I can't pretend they're not there. I walked into that hotel on Friday afternoon feeling tired and ready for a quiet weekend. I remember the sign out front looked half faded, and the parking area was full of cracks. I had driven about 3 hours from the city and just wanted a decent bed and a hot shower. The place looked small, old, and a bit run down, but I wasn't looking for luxury. I just wanted a break from my usual routine. I never thought I'd leave that place with my nerves shot and my mind running in circles. But things took a strange turn in that old building, and I can't get the memory out of my head. When I stepped into the lobby, I smelled something like old carpet and stale coffee. The walls had a dull beige color with some peeling spots near the ceiling. A single light flickered near the reception desk. There was a tall man with thin hair behind the counter. He looked at me without much expression and asked if I had a reservation. I told him I'd booked a room online just for the weekend. He nodded and flipped through a ledger before handing me a key attached to a small plastic tag. The number on the tag was 104. I remember glancing around the lobby and noticing a single couch against one wall. The cushion was torn on one corner. There was a stand with brochures for local attractions, but most of them looked outdated. No one else was around. It felt almost deserted. I asked if there were any nearby places to eat, and the man said something about a diner. A few miles down the road, he didn't smile or offer any additional help. He just told me to enjoy my stay in a flat tone. I grabbed my small suitcase and headed for the stairs. Since there didn't seem to be an elevator on the way to the room, I noticed the hallway lighting was dim. It hummed quietly like a tired electrical system trying to keep up. The carpet felt squishy under my shoes as if it hadn't dried from some old cleaning. The air smelled musty and I felt a slight chill when I reached the door to room 104. I had to jiggle the key in the lock for a few seconds. The handle felt loose. Once inside, I saw the room had a single bed, a small table with one chair, and a tall mirror on a wooden stand in the corner. The bathroom door was to my left. Everything looked clean enough at first glance, though the wallpaper had some stains near the floor. I set my suitcase down and sat on the bed. It creaked loudly, but it felt okay for a short stay. I didn't think much of the atmosphere. Yet I unpacked some clothes, put my toiletries in the bathroom, and tried the shower. The water pressure was weak, but it got warm enough. I changed into more comfortable clothes and decided to lie down for a bit. While I rested, I could hear faint noises from outside, mostly wind rustling near the window around dinner time. I went back downstairs and asked if there was a vending machine. The receptionist pointed me to a small room near the back with a few snacks and sodas. I decided to drive to the diner he mentioned. Instead, the diner was small but had decent food. I grabbed a burger and fries, then went back to the hotel. By then it was already dark. The parking lot only had a few lamps and they flickered. I felt uneasy, but I chalked it up to being tired. I made my way back to my room, noticing that the hallway smelled like old paint. The silence felt heavier than before. At some point, I caught my own reflection in one of the glass frames on the wall and felt startled. My heart sped up for a second, but I laughed it off. I locked the door behind me and tossed my jacket on the chair. I brushed my teeth in the small bathroom and then returned to the main area. The mirror in the corner seemed to catch my eye. It was an older style with a wide wooden frame around it. Some small chips in the corners. I checked myself in it for no real reason. Just habit, I guess. I remember noticing how pale I looked under the weak light from the lamp on the table. After that, I switched off the lamp and got into bed. The sheets were rough, but they smelled freshly washed. I fell asleep without much trouble. Sometime after midnight, though, I woke up feeling disoriented. The room was pitch black, except for a faint glow from the parking lot. Light that seeped in around the curtains. My heart was pounding. I wasn't sure what had startled me. Then I noticed the mirror in the corner. I couldn't see it clearly, but I sensed something was off. My skin prickled. I felt a chill run down my arms. I leaned forward and squinted, trying to see if there was something near the mirror. I thought I saw a shape standing behind me in the reflection. It was just a dark figure, hard to make out. My heart thumped so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I turned on the bedside lamp. The shape disappeared instantly. I looked around the room and found nothing. The chair was empty, the curtains were closed, and there was no one else in there. I felt a drop of sweat roll down my temple. My mouth was dry. I walked over to the mirror and checked behind it. There was just a wall. I rubbed my eyes, assuming I was groggy and imagining things. I left the light on for a while, but eventually I turned it off again. I tried to calm down, repeating in my head that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I managed to drift off again after some time. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. My back ached from the stiff mattress. I got dressed and stepped out to find something for breakfast. The receptionist was there, barely looking up from a newspaper. I didn't mention my weird experience. I just asked if the coffee was fresh. He gestured toward a small pot next to the front desk. It was lukewarm and tasted burnt, but I drank it anyway. I ate a stale-looking donut from a box on the counter. The taste was bland, but I forced it down because I was hungry after breakfast. I drove around the area. There wasn't much to see. Mostly trees, a few houses scattered along the highway. I spotted a small grocery store and picked up a bottle of water, some snacks, and an energy drink. I wasn't in the mood to explore any attractions, so I just killed time until early afternoon when I got back to the hotel. The lobby was empty. I walked up to my room and tried to ignore how quiet everything felt. I spent most of that day in my room, scrolling through my phone, watching a little TV on the tiny set mounted on the wall. The channels were fuzzy and there weren't many options at one point. I heard a thump in the hallway, so I opened the door. No one was there. I thought maybe another guest had dropped something. The corridor was silent again. I shrugged it off and went back inside. By that point, I was feeling restless. The place had this strange vibe, like no one ever smiled or made noise. The only time I heard voices was when the receptionist talked on the phone, and even that was a low mumble. That night, I found myself staring at the mirror again. I kept thinking about what I'd seen the night before. I decided I wouldn't let it get to me. I was sure it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake this nervous energy in my stomach around bedtime. I got under the covers, turned off the light, and closed my eyes. The wind outside picked up. I heard it whistling around the corners of the building. The room felt colder than before. I pulled the blanket up to my neck and tried to relax. Sometime after midnight, I snapped awake again. My eyes darted around the room. It was dark, but the mirror was visible in the corner. My heart started pounding all over again. I had that same prickling sensation on my skin. I glanced at the mirror and my blood went cold. I saw a figure in the reflection again, standing behind where I was lying near the headboard. It was just a dark outline, but it seemed taller than me. My heart hammered against my ribs. I could barely breathe. I reached for the lamp, fumbling for the switch. My fingers felt clumsy when I turned it on. The figure vanished. I twisted around and looked behind me. Nothing was there. The room was empty. I sat up, trying to steady my breathing. My mouth went dry and I felt sweat on my forehead. My legs felt weak when I stood. I walked over to the mirror and stood in front of it. Staring at my own face, my eyes looked wild, and I noticed my hair sticking out on one side. I stood there for a minute, waiting to see if anything else appeared. The mirror showed only me and the rest of the small room. I pulled the mirror away from the wall a bit, checking behind it again. Still nothing. I felt silly, but I couldn't deny the terror. I'd felt my arms had goosebumps and my stomach churned. I didn't sleep much after that. I left the lamp on and tried to rest with my eyes half closed. Every little sound made me jump. The hours dragged until morning. I got up early again, threw on my clothes, and decided I couldn't stay another night in that room. I just wanted to get out of there. I packed my bag in a hurry, shoving my things inside without folding anything. I felt anxious, and my hands shook a bit. I wanted to leave before the feeling got any worse. When I headed downstairs, the receptionist was there again. He watched me for a moment, then picked up a small envelope from the counter. He handed it to me without a word. I asked him who it was from. He just said it was left for me earlier, and he didn't know by who I opened it. Right there in the lobby, it was a short note on a plain piece of paper. It said, "Avoid room 1. 04 next time. For your own good." I looked at him waiting for an explanation. He just stared back, his face rigid. I asked why he didn't give me an answer. He only said, "We usually don't book that room," in a quiet voice, then cleared his throat and looked away. My stomach tightened. I felt anger and confusion rising in my chest. I wanted to demand more details, but I also just wanted to get out of there. My heart was pounding again, and I felt a headache coming on, so I turned away, grabbed my suitcase, and walked out the door outside. The day was cold and the sky looked gray. I loaded my stuff into my car, my hands feeling numb. I glanced back at the hotel, one last time wondering if I'd imagined everything, but the note was still in my pocket and the fear was fresh in my mind. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. My eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, I half expected to see a shape in the back seat, but it was empty. During the drive home, I kept replaying. The moment I saw the figure in the mirror, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light or a dream, but the fear I felt was real. My throat had gone tight. My stomach churned and my heart raced, as though I'd seen something tangible. By the time I reached the city, I still felt uneasy. I parked in my usual spot and carried my suitcase inside without talking to anyone. Once I was in my apartment, I locked the door and stood still. For a moment, the silence felt better. They're less oppressive. I never got an explanation for the note. I called the hotel a few days later, trying to speak to the same receptionist. But someone else answered. They told me there was no record of a note. They said room 104 was just a normal room. When I asked to speak to the guy who had given me the key, they said he worked there part-time and wasn't available. I tried one more time a week later, but I couldn't reach him. Eventually, I gave up. I just accepted that the place had something off about it. And I wasn't going back now. Whenever I pass by a mirror in a dim room, I feel a little nervous. Sometimes I catch myself checking the corners, making sure there's no one lurking in the reflection. It's not something I can easily explain to other people. They'd probably laugh or think I'm exaggerating, but I know what I saw. Even if it was just a shape or a shadow, I remember the terror. My body's reaction was too strong to ignore more. I can't say exactly what happened in that hotel. I only know that I saw something in the mirror 2 nights in a row, and every time I turned around it was gone. I know the receptionist gave me a note telling me never to stay in that room again, though he wouldn't explain why. And I know that right now I have no desire to go near that place. I still have the note folded in a drawer. Sometimes I take it out and read it again, but it doesn't offer any clues. It just reminds me that room 104 is a place I never want to see again. I haven't told many people about this. It still gives me chills. All I can say is that if you ever find yourself in a lonely hotel with a tall mirror in the corner, pay attention if you see something in that reflection that shouldn't be there. Trust your instincts. That's all I've got. I spent one weekend in that room and I'll never forget it. I woke up on my second night in the new apartment and felt my pulse hammering in my throat. I could hear a faint creak near the front door. At first I stayed still in bed, my eyes glued to the hallway. I didn't see anything in the darkness, but my stomach twisted. Something felt off. I got up, walked over to the doorway, and flipped on the overhead light. The apartment looked normal. Nothing was out of place, but I could still hear that slow squeak somewhere like metal rubbing against metal. I moved in here last week. The building's old with chipped paint on the walls and faded tiles in the kitchen. The landlord warned me about a few quirks, noisy, plumbing, drafty windows. He didn't mention hinges that squeak all night or windows that unlock themselves the first night. I wrote it off as ordinary old building noises, but after that second night, I couldn't brush it off so easily. During the day, the place seems normal. The living room has an old couch I bought online. My TV sits on a rickety stand, the kitchen cabinets stick, and sometimes I have to yank on them to open them. The bathroom light flickers if I leave it on too long. Everything is manageable during daylight. It's at night that things get strange. I started hearing the squeaking noise. Every time I lay down in bed, I would sit there, arms crossed over my chest, waiting the sound would start near the kitchen, then fade, then come back near the living room window. It didn't follow a clear pattern. When it stopped for a while, I'd feel relief, but then it would start again. Sometimes I wondered if a neighbor upstairs was pacing, but the building's walls are thick. I barely hear footsteps. This squeaking felt closer, almost like it was coming from my own apartment. I tried turning on some music to mask it. That lasted maybe 15 minutes. Then I heard a soft click and realized my bedroom window was open. I knew I locked it. I got up, walked to the window, and felt a cold breeze hit my face. My hands were trembling. I touched the latch. It was flipped up. I couldn't figure out how it got that way. I pushed it down and heard it click into place. I tested it by tugging on the window frame. It stayed shut. I went back to bed telling myself I must have forgotten to lock it the next morning. I woke up with that same uneasy feeling. My neck felt tense and my eyes were dry. I checked the window. First thing, it was unlocked again. This time I knew for sure I had locked it. I remembered the exact moment I pressed the latch down. My breath caught in my throat. I tried not to panic. I looked around for any signs of forced entry. Nothing. I lifted the window up and examined the lock mechanism. It didn't look broken. I tested it a few times and it stayed locked. I left the apartment for work, feeling rattled at work. I couldn't focus. All I could think about were those squeaks at night and the window unlocking itself. I got home after dark. The building hallway smelled musty. The overhead light in the corridor buzzed and flickered. I stepped into my apartment and checked every corner, the living room, the tiny dining area, the kitchen, and the bedroom. Everything was where I left it, but when I reached the bathroom, I saw sound near the front door. My chest felt tight. I moved toward the door, phone's flashlight shining ahead. The doorknob was jiggling like someone was trying to turn it from the other side. Then it went still. I listened, but I didn't hear any footsteps in the hallway. I put my hand on the door, and it was cold. I slid the deadbolt open and swung the door wide. The corridor was empty. I shut the door again, locked it, and backed away. My pulse pounded in my ears. That's when I noticed my bedroom window was wide open. I hadn't heard it slide. I rushed over and looked outside. There was only the dim glow of a street lamp below. The wind blew in, rustling my curtains. I closed it, locked it, and tested the latch several times. The perfume smell drifted by my nose. Again, I gagged from the intensity. Suddenly, a sharp clang came from the kitchen. I ran in there and found a pot rolling on the floor. The cabinet door above it was open. I hadn't touched that pot in weeks. That was the last straw I grabbed. The pot shoved it back in the cabinet and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly that I knocked over a glass of water on the counter. Water spilled everywhere. I mopped it up with a F-towel, tossed the towel in the sink, and decided I wasn't spending another night in that bedroom. I grabbed a blanket, my phone charger, and headed to the living room. I plopped onto the couch and forced myself to breathe slowly. The living room felt safer. The overhead light was harsh, but I kept it on. I tried to calm down by scrolling through my phone, checking random news updates, anything to keep my mind off the noises. At some point, I managed to fall asleep. I woke up to early morning sunlight coming through the window. My neck was stiff and my back ached, but at least I hadn't heard anything else. The rest of the night, for the next few days, I slept on the couch. I avoided the bedroom. Whenever I walked in there to grab clothes, I felt a chill. I made sure to lock the windows and ignore the squeaking hinges at night. If I heard any noise, I'd crank up the volume on the TV. It worked, kind of. I still felt anxious and jumpy one evening. I tried to gather up the courage to sleep in my bedroom again. I changed the sheets, vacuumed the floor, and even sprayed some air freshener to mask that perfume smell when bedtime came. I stood in the doorway. Heart racing, I told myself I wasn't going to let some weird noises scare me out of my own room. I laid down, turned off the light, and pulled the covers up to my chin. I stared at the ceiling. Minutes passed inside. Silence. My eyelids got heavy. I rolled onto my side. I wasn't sure how long I slept, but I jolted awake when I felt a presence near the door. I couldn't see anything, but I had the overwhelming impression that someone was standing there staring at me. My breath caught in my throat. I lunged for the lamp switch. The room flooded with light. The door was closed. Nobody was there, but I smelled that same perfume stronger than ever. It was like the air was saturated with it. My eyes watered from how intense it was. I stumbled out of bed, hand over my nose, and flung the door open. I paced the hallway, my heart pounding. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't stay in that room with that smell. It was overwhelming. I spent the rest of the night on the couch again, thinking about what to do. I didn't want to deal with unknown visitors, squeaking hinges, and windows that seemed to unlock themselves. My body felt worn down. Every muscle in my neck and shoulders was tight. My head pounded. I felt dehydrated. Each time I tried to relax, I heard another small noise. Somewhere in the apartment the next morning, I started packing up my things. I couldn't handle it anymore. I grabbed moving boxes from the closet and began filling them with my clothes, my books, and my kitchenware by the afternoon. The apartment looked half empty. I left the windows locked, closed the bedroom door, and shoved a few final items into a suitcase. I didn't care about the lease I just wanted out. I called a friend who owns a pickup truck and asked for help. He agreed to come by the next day. That night was my last night in the apartment. I slept on the couch with the lights on. The building was quiet, but I didn't trust it. I kept glancing at the hallway, expecting to see the door slowly creak open. My friend arrived in the morning, and we loaded my boxes into his truck. As we carried the last box out, I heard a faint squeak. I froze in the hallway. I realized it was the apartment door hinge, the same squeak I'd heard in the middle of the night. I closed the door for the final time, locked it, and walked away. The landlord wouldn't get a second month's rent from me. I was done. I didn't see any figure that morning, and there was no perfume smell when I left. But my skin still prickled even outside on the sidewalk. I couldn't shake that tense feeling. I climbed into my friend's truck, slammed the door, and watched the old apartment building fade in the rearview mirror. My heart rate slowly settled. I was relieved to be gone. I wanted to breathe fresh air and sleep without fear. That's all I wanted, and as far as I was concerned, I wasn't stepping foot in that place again. I parked my truck outside that old country house and felt a chill crawl across my skin before I even stepped inside. The place looked quiet and still, but I had this nagging sense that something was off. I'd inspected dozens of homes over the years, and I usually shrugged off bad feelings this time. Something made my chest tighten. I went in anyway, thinking I just needed to check the structure, make a few notes, and leave. It didn't turn out that simple. I'm Robert Ellis. I've been in the home inspection business for over 15 years. I'm used to creaky floors, drafty attics, and suspicious rattles in the walls. But this house made my mouth dry as soon as I walked through the door. It was a 2-story farmhouse with chipped paint on the siding and a rusted weather vane on top. The porch was uneven and one of the posts seemed warped by moisture. I noticed those details out of habit, but my main focus was on the attic because the owner had told me to pay special attention to the beams. He'd said they might be damaged and he was worried about collapse. I opened the front door and smelled dust mixed with something stale. The hallway was dark, lit only by the small windows in the adjacent rooms. My boots echoed on the wooden floor, which creaked under my weight. I glanced around, noting the peeling wallpaper and the thin layer of dirt on everything. My flashlight beam revealed a few cobwebs in the corners. I saw some old furniture left behind a sofa, a few chairs, a cabinet missing a door. It felt like nobody had been in there for a long time. I moved through the living room and headed for the staircase. There was a short flight of steps leading to the second floor. Each step groaned at the top. I walked down a narrow hallway until I found a pull-down ladder that led to the attic. A simple chain hung from the ceiling, and I tugged it. The ladder came down with a stiff screech of metal hinges. It sounded loud in the silence. Before I climbed up, I shined my flashlight into the attic opening. The darkness up there seemed heavy, as if the light didn't penetrate far. I wasn't sure why it bothered me so much. I've been in countless A-sets, some creepier than this. But that day, my palms felt damp and my pulse throbbed in my neck. Still, I had a job to do. I climbed up step by step until my head poked into the attic. I scanned the space with my flashlight. I saw wide wooden beams. Crossing beneath the roof, I also noticed random items scattered on the floorboards. A couple of suitcases, some clothes, a broken lamp, a few books with bent spines. It looked like somebody had been in the middle of packing, but then left in a hurry. Nothing was neatly stacked or stored. Everything was just tossed around. I climbed the rest of the way and stood on the creaking boards. The attic smelled musty and the air felt colder than downstairs. I zipped my jacket a bit higher and rubbed my hands together. My breath felt heavy, like the air was thicker than usual. I set my toolkit down near the opening and walked carefully toward the rafters. I touched the wood, checking for rot or insect damage. The beams felt solid in some places, soft in others. I made mental notes and then checked the nails and connectors. My flashlight picked up dust motes swirling in the air. Each exhale made a faint white cloud, which told me it was colder than normal. The temperature shouldn't have been that low, not in early autumn, and especially not during midday. I started to feel uneasy, like someone was standing behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I tried to stay focused on my inspection. I bent down and looked at a section where the beam met the roof. There were some old water stains. I tapped the wood with a small hammer to see if it was hollow. Then I heard a faint shuffle behind me. It sounded like something scraping across the floor. I quickly stood up and swung my flashlight back. The light fell on a cardboard box that looked damp and partially collapsed. Nothing else seemed to be moving. I told myself it was probably just a rodent or a loose board. My heart thumped harder than usual, and I realized I was clenching my teeth. I forced a slow exhale and kept working in. I jotted down notes about the condition of the rafters. After a few minutes, that cold feeling around me got stronger. The attic had no open windows and there wasn't any wind yet. I felt a draft swirling around my legs. It made me shiver. My breath was now visible with every exhale, like I was standing outside on a winter day. My nose felt numb and my fingers were stiff. I decided I had enough information. I didn't see any major structural issues. Beyond some rot and possible leaks, I thought it was time to get out of there, but on my way back toward the attic ladder, my foot kicked something. It felt soft like cloth or a sweater. I shined my flashlight down and saw a jacket on the floor. It looked worn with a rip along one sleeve and mud stains on the hem. I didn't see any tags. I nudged it aside to keep going, but something about it made me pause. It was an ordinary jacket, but the way it was dropped there near a battered suitcase and a pair of boots felt strange. I picked up the boots. They were caked with dried mud laces missing. It looked like someone yanked them off in a hurry and never bothered to clean them. I was trying to imagine why someone would leave all this stuff behind. I found a wallet next to the boots too. The leather was worn and I opened it without thinking. There was no ID inside, just a couple of faded receipts. The dates were from 5 years ago. That made me uneasy. This stuff had been here a while, but the layer of dust didn't look that thick. I had inspected other abandoned houses, and usually the dust was thicker. After so many years, this place felt like it had been left recently, but the receipt said otherwise. That contradiction sank a weird feeling into my gut. I decided I was overthinking. It may be the owner had come by occasionally and shuffled things around that could explain the disturbed dust. I closed the wallet and put it back. Then I heard a creak behind me that sounded like a footstep. I whipped around, shining my flashlight in every direction. The beam shook a little because my hand was trembling. I saw boxes, suitcases, and old furniture draped with sheets. Nothing moved. I listened for a few seconds. Breathing hard, I could only hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I took another step toward the ladder and it felt like the cold air was wrapping around my body. My spine tingled. I glanced over my shoulder, afraid I might see someone or something standing there. The flashlight only revealed the same cluttered space. I rushed to the ladder, set my foot on the top rung, and then felt a sudden pressure on my shoulder. It wasn't a push exactly. It felt like someone touching me lightly. My skin crawled under my jacket and I let out a startled grunt. I spun around so fast that I almost lost my balance. My flashlight beam jumped across the rafters. There was nothing there. My shoulder felt cold though, like I brushed up against a block of ice. My breathing became ragged. I had trouble swallowing. Every instinct told me to get down the ladder and out of that house. I moved quickly, almost stumbling as I descended. The wooden ladder shook beneath me and I gripped the sides until my knuckles turned white. I dropped into the hallway and shoved the ladder back up. I heard it snap into place, then I hurried down the stairs, nearly skipping steps. My boots landed heavily and the boards creaked in protest. By the time I reached the front door, my hand shook so badly that I fumbled with the doorknob. I yanked the door open and stepped onto the porch, gulping fresh air. The midday light felt harsh after the darkness inside. I stood there, breathing fast, trying to get my pulse under control. Outside, the cold sensation began to fade, but I still felt tense. My heart pounded and the muscles in my shoulders ached from being so tight. I realized I had left my notepad and some of my tools in the attic. I almost considered leaving them there, but that was a ridiculous thought. Those tools were expensive and I couldn't afford to lose them. I forced myself to calm down. I told myself there was nothing actually there, that I was just spooked by the strange atmosphere and the abandoned belongings. Maybe I let my imagination get the best of me. I decided to walk around the outside of the house. First check the exterior and then go back for my things. Later I figured I needed to clear my head. I paced around the property, examining the foundation, the siding, and the roof. From the outside, the boards on one side looked warped. The gutters were full of leaves. Some of the windows were cracked. Normal wear and tear for a place that had been left alone for a while. I tried to focus on my job, but every few minutes my mind drifted back to that attic. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. Eventually I realized I was just delaying the inevitable. I had to go get my stuff. I walked back to the front door, took a deep breath, and stepped inside again. The air felt heavy, though not as cold as before. I went upstairs, my boots echoing in the quiet. My stomach churned with anxiety and my palms started sweating again when I reached the pull-down ladder. I paused. I listened for any sound. Nothing. I grabbed the chain and eased the ladder down. My flashlight was still in my hand. I clicked it on and aimed it into the attic. The space looked exactly the same, just shadows and random junk scattered around. I climbed up slowly, telling myself I would grab my gear and leave. Right away, my notepad was near the rafters and my toolkit was on the floor next to it. I forced myself to walk across the boards. Each step felt like a challenge. My breath quickened as I reached my things. I shoved the notepad into my jacket pocket and grabbed the toolkit by the handle. Then I heard another soft scuffling sound. My chest tightened. I turned my flashlight toward the source of the noise. The beam revealed a suitcase with a corner ripped open, and I thought maybe a small animal was inside it, but I didn't see any movement. I backed away, keeping the flashlight aimed forward. The cold crept in again, and I felt a prickling sensation on my arms. My lips felt numb, and there was a tightness in my throat. I stepped carefully, trying not to trip over the clutter. Just as I was about to reach the ladder, I heard the creak again, like a board shifting underweight. It came from behind me. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, and a bead of sweat rolled down the side of my face. I didn't turn around, I just kept moving. I made it to the ladder opening and climbed down fast the moment my feet touched the hallway floor. I gave the ladder a hard shove. It sprang up and banged against the ceiling. My breathing was loud in my own ears. My hand shook and I held the toolkit in a death grip. I hurried down the steps, careful not to trip and break my neck. I was out the front door in seconds. Once outside, I didn't even bother to lock up. The owner had given me a key, but I just left it in the door. I'd sort it out with him later. I rushed to my truck, tossed my toolkit on the passenger seat, and slammed the door shut. My head was pounding and my hands were clammy. I started the engine and cranked the heat. Even though I was already sweating, I wanted to get warm or maybe just feel normal again. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced at the farmhouse. The upstairs window looked dark. I had this urge to look away, but I couldn't. I half expected to see a face peering out from behind the dirty glass, but there was nothing. Still, the hair on my arm stood on end. I turned my eyes to the road and pressed my foot on the gas. Leaving that place behind me, the ride home was tense. I kept replaying everything in my mind. Those random belongings tossed around the sudden cold, the noises behind me, that strange touch on my shoulder. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was a Dr. Ra and maybe my nerves were on edge for no real reason, but none of that explained why I felt so certain that something wanted to follow me out. It was just a feeling, but it was strong. Even after I got back to my place, showered and changed, I couldn't shake the unease. I wrote up the report later, focusing on the structural issues, the rotted beams, the water damage, the compromised flooring. I avoided mentioning the cold or the strange sounds. Clients don't pay me to write ghost stories. They pay me to talk about wood rot and insulation, yet I couldn't help thinking about those suitcases. The clothes and the muddy boots left behind, it looked like the owner of those things had been in a rush. There was no note or indication of where that person went. Everything just sat there waiting in the attic. And when I stood among those scattered belongings, I felt like that emptiness was watching me. I'm not one to believe in haunted houses or anything like that, but that attic made me question a few things. I never told the homeowner about the strange cold or the sense that something was up there with me. I kept it to myself. I also didn't ask him why all those personal items were abandoned. He might have had a simple explanation, and I didn't really want to know. All I knew was that I'd done my job. I'd inspected the beams, and I wouldn't be going back there unless someone paid me a fortune to do so. That's the end of it for the most part. I still think about it when I'm alone in another dark attic or basement checking for leaks or pests. Sometimes I feel a similar draft or hear a creak, and my stomach tightens. I remember how my breath turned visible and how it felt like something pressed on my shoulder. My reaction is different now. I move a bit faster, keep my flashlight steady, and remind myself that I'm just there to do a job. Still, I can't forget that house, and I'm not sure I ever want to step inside it again. I noticed something wasn't right. The first day I set foot in that old house, the front door creaked in a way that made me tense and the hallway smelled stale. I had just inherited the property from a distant uncle. I didn't have fond memories of him or the house, but I needed a place to stay. I moved my bags into the foyer and looked around the walls. Had yellowed wallpaper and the floorboards groaned with every step. I felt uneasy. My chest felt tight and my palms were clammy. The place felt occupied. Even though I was alone, I made my way through each room, flipping the light switches. The electricity was supposed to be off at the main breaker until I arranged a new account, but some bulbs still glowed faintly. I checked the breaker box in the basement. The switch was off. I flipped it on and off a few times to test it. The overhead lights in the living room flickered, but they never went out completely. I felt my heartbeat pick up. There was no logical reason for it. I took a breath, shrugged it off, and went back upstairs. The office was the room that caught my attention right away. It had a large wooden desk with drawers on both sides. Old books and folders were stacked in corners, and the ceiling fan was off. At that moment, I stood near the doorway, flipping the wall switch up and down. The fan didn't budge. I tapped the blades lightly with my fingers. They felt solid. I checked the chain hanging from the motor. It clicked, but the fan didn't turn. I assumed it was broken that night. I settled in the bedroom down the hall from the office. I didn't unpack much. I just threw a couple of changes of clothes into a closet and set my toothbrush in the bathroom. The house was cold, even though it was still warm outside. I dragged an extra blanket onto the bed when I laid down. I listened to every single noise, the creak of the stairs settling, the faint hum in the walls, and my own breathing. I felt my throat tighten. I forced myself to shut my eyes. Sometime around midnight, I heard a light whirring sound. It was low-pitched like a dull motor noise. I got up and followed the sound into the hallway. The floor felt chilly against my bare feet. My shoulders felt stiff, and I noticed goosebumps on my arms at the office door. I realized the ceiling fan was spinning. The pull chain swayed slightly, and the blades rotated at a slow speed. The overhead light fixture was off. The entire room was dim. I stood there staring at the rotating blades. I reached for the wall switch. It was in the off position. I flipped it up, then down. Nothing changed. The fan kept spinning. I walked over to the desk lamp, clicked it on. The fan was still going. Even though there was no power indicated on the breaker box, I reached up to grab the chain the moment I touched it. The fan slowed and stopped. My chest felt heavy. I wiped sweat from my upper lip. I told myself it was a wiring issue or some leftover power in the lines. I got a chair and examined the motor housing. I saw dust and a few old cobwebs. I didn't see any fresh wiring or anything suspicious. I climbed down, turned off the desk lamp, and stood there in the dark. The fan remained still. I went back to bed the next day. I tried calling an electrician, but he couldn't come out until the end of the week. I spent most of the morning cleaning out old boxes in the living room. I heard the fan turn on once around lunchtime, but by the time I got to the office, it had stopped again. It felt frustrating, and I wanted to see it in action, but it always seemed to stop. Right before I arrived, the house remained quiet for the rest of the afternoon. By evening, the air felt thick. It was hot outside, but the house felt cold that night. I double-checked the breaker box. I saw that the main breaker was clearly in the off position. No power should have been running anywhere. I left it that way because I wanted to observe if anything else happened. I went to bed around 11. My muscle felt tense, and I had a small headache. The room was silent. I drifted off. I jolted awake at around 2 in the morning. My heart raced. I didn't hear anything particular, but I felt an urge to get up. I sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing my face. The air in the bedroom smelled slightly musty. I stepped into the hallway with the lights off, guided by the moonlight. Through the windows, my footsteps were slow and my breathing was shallow. The hallway light switch didn't respond because the power was off. I felt uneasy, but I kept moving. My chest tightened when I noticed a faint movement near the office. It was dark, but I sensed something shift. I approached the office door. The fan was still, its chain hung motionless, and the room was silent. I glanced around but saw nothing out of place. My neck tingled and the hairs on my arms stood up. I backed out into the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like something brushed against my shoulder from behind. I froze. My stomach dropped and I whipped around. There was no one there. I felt a slight pressure against my shoulder, like someone had placed a hand on me. I rubbed my arm trying to calm myself, but my heart pounded. I could hear it in my ears. The hallway remained empty. I stood there for a minute trying to gather my thoughts. Then I headed back to my room. I couldn't stop looking behind me. My back felt exposed. I got into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. My breathing was shaky. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on its flashlight. I scanned the corners of the bedroom. I didn't see anything. I placed the phone next to me face up so I could grab it quickly if I needed sleep. Came in short bursts. I drifted off for maybe half an hour at a time. Each time I woke, my heart was hammering. I worried something would be standing in the corner, but I never saw anyone by morning. I was exhausted. My eyes felt gritty. My neck muscles burned. I grabbed a quick shower and forced myself to eat some cereal. I called the electrician again to see if he could come sooner, but he told me he was booked. I tried to keep myself occupied by exploring the rest of the house. I opened closets, looked under the stairs, and checked the basement more thoroughly. I found old furniture, tools, and a lot of junk. Nothing seemed unusual, just old. Yet every so often I would hear that faint whirring sound. Sometimes it stopped before I could pinpoint it. A few times I'd rush to the office, but the fan would be motionless. My frustration turned into anxiety around dusk. I brought a small folding chair into the office. I set it against the wall, facing the fan. I wanted to see it turn on by itself. I wanted proof it wasn't my imagination. The room felt cold even though it was warm outside. My legs bounced and my palms stayed sweaty. I watched the ceiling. The fan stayed still for over an hour. My eyes felt heavy, so I got up and started rummaging through the desk drawers. I found old ledgers, some receipts, a few handwritten notes. The notes mentioned minor repairs around the house, but nothing about the fan. I went back to the chair and waited another 30 minutes. Nothing happened. I stood up and headed into the hallway. I was about to call it a night when I heard a soft humming. I spun around and saw the fan turning. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I walked back into the office. The fan's chain was swinging. The blades moved slowly, the overhead light on. The fan was off, so the room was dim. I heard the blade cutting the air. I stood there in disbelief. My heart pounded so hard that my chest hurt. I reached for the wall switch. It was off, but the fan spun. I stepped closer to the center of the room. My legs shook. I lifted a hand to the pull chain, but I hesitated. My skin felt prickly, and I noticed my breathing quickened. I yanked the chain. The blades slowed down in an unnatural way. They didn't coast to a stop like a normal fan. They seemed to slow in a halting motion, almost step by step until they froze in place. A drop of sweat rolled down my temple. I felt a chill spread across my back. I tried to remain calm, but my mind raced with confusion. I went back to the hallway, keeping my eyes on the fan for as long as I could. Once I was in the hallway, I felt a sudden pressure behind me. It was the same feeling as the previous night. My shoulder jerked forward. I spun around expecting to see someone. Nothing. My ears rang my stomach, twisted into a knot. I walked backward until I reached my bedroom door. My legs were shaky and my heart felt like it was going to explode. I shut the bedroom door behind me and locked it. I stood there for a few minutes, pressing my head against the wood. My breath came in short gasps. My pulse throbbed in my throat. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, thinking about calling someone. I didn't know who to call, maybe a friend, maybe the electrician, maybe a neighbor. But it was late, and I was embarrassed to explain why I was so rattled by a ceiling fan. I stayed there, breathing in and out, trying to slow my heartbeat. The room felt dark and oppressive. Finally, I decided to place a chair against the door handle. I pushed the dresser too. Adding another barrier, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling phone. Flashlight on. I didn't sleep more than a few minutes at a time. The next morning I woke up with a stiff back. I moved the dresser and chair aside. grabbed my phone, and took a walk around the house. The floor seemed quieter in daylight, but the atmosphere felt heavy. My nerves were fried. I went to the kitchen to make coffee, but the coffee maker wouldn't turn on. Right, the breaker was off. I stepped outside to get some air. The bright sunlight hurt my eyes. My mind felt scrambled. I paced on the porch for a bit. Then I decided I would wait for the electrician. If he couldn't fix it, I'd just move out. I had no deep attachment to this place. I thought about selling it as soon as possible. I spent most of the afternoon outside. I took a short drive around town, ate at a small diner, and tried to keep my focus on regular life. I felt uneasy the whole time, worrying about what might be going on back in that house. My muscles were tense. My stomach churned. I planned to leave the main breaker off for good. No reason to mess with it. I came back around early evening and unlocked the door, carefully expecting something to jump out at me. The foyer was still, the living room was quiet. The office door was open and the fan was off. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but that stale odor lingered and my chest felt tight again. I knew I had at least one more night before the electrician arrived. I decided I'd barricade myself again in the bedroom if anything strange happened. I checked all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked. I gathered some snacks, water, and a flashlight in my room. I was determined to stay in there and wait out the night if I heard or felt anything. Again, it was around midnight when I started to doze off. I had my phone on the nightstand, volume turned up. The bed felt uncomfortable, but I forced my eyes to stay shut. Suddenly, I heard a faint clack from the hallway. It reminded me of the sound of the fan's chain hitting the blades. My heart rate jumped. I tried to ignore it. Then I heard a dragging sound like something brushing against the wall. My chest tightened. I grabbed the phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam shook because my hand was trembling. I got out of bed and put my ear to the door. My breath was shallow. The sound seemed to stop. I slowly opened the door. A crack, the hallway was dark. My phone flashlight lit up dust. Mows in the air, everything looked still. I took one step forward. My hand was on the doorknob and I felt my mouth go dry. A sudden chill raced across my skin. Something touched the back of my neck. I jerked around, shining the light behind me. Nothing. My spine tingled and I felt sweat sliding down my back. I slammed the bedroom door shut again. My heart pounded, my hands shook. I didn't sleep until sunrise. When the first light came through the window, I felt a slight relief. I told myself the electrician would come soon and I would get this fixed or walk away. I left the bedroom door locked and listened for any sounds. The house was quiet in the daylight. I hoped it would stay that way until help arrived. I sat there counting the minutes, refusing to leave the bedroom unless I absolutely had to. The sense of being watched never left me. My shoulders still felt odd, as though that touch had never gone away. I'll never forget the first night I spent in that old building. I could feel every creak, every shift in the beams, like the place was breathing around me. I'd been so excited to move in because the rent was cheap and it was close to my job. But after a few days, that excitement turned into something else, something that made me tense up at night. Waiting for sounds that shouldn't be there, I moved into the top floor, a cramped apartment with water stains on the ceiling, uneven floorboards, and a window that rattled on windy nights. The hallway leading to my unit was always dark because the overhead light flickered so much that the landlord finally just turned it off. I remember hauling my boxes in and noticing the stale odor that seemed to come from the walls. It wasn't strong at first, it was just this underlying hint of dampness. I figured it was normal for such an old building, so I dismissed it. On my third night, I was sitting on my couch trying to set up my TV when I heard something that made me freeze. It was like voices coming through the walls, but there was no one living in the apartment next door. I checked the rental listings. That apartment was empty and had been for months. At first I thought maybe the sound was traveling from another floor, but it was too close. It felt like it was right behind my wall. I got up, walked over to the wall, and pressed my ear against it. The murmuring stopped the second I did that. I stood there with my ear against the paint, breathing quietly, feeling a slight chill run across my arms. I didn't hear anything else. I tried to shake it off and went to bed, but I kept waking up every hour or so thinking. I heard that low, muffled talk again the next morning. I was groggy and irritated. I told myself I'd probably just imagined it. Maybe the pipes were making weird noises, or maybe someone left a radio on in one of the lower units. Still, I couldn't forget how close those voices had seemed the following night. The same thing happened. I was in bed staring at the cracks in the ceiling when I heard that low hushed tone again. It sounded like one person talking, then a pause, then another person responding, but the words weren't clear. It was like trying to listen to someone through thick layers of concrete. I got out of bed, walked to the wall, and listened again. It stopped as soon as I got close. My heart was pounding in my chest. I walked around the apartment, flipping on every light. I checked the hallway. It was empty and silent. Except for that faint buzzing of old electrical wiring. I went back in, closed and locked the door, and sat on the edge of my couch, feeling my fingers trembling against my thighs. I felt this tightness in my stomach that wouldn't go away. It was the first time I thought maybe there was something off about the building itself. But I pushed that thought aside because it didn't make sense to me. Buildings don't talk. There had to be a logical reason. The next day I bumped into the landlord in the lobby. He was an older guy with stooped shoulders and a thick mustache. I told him about the sounds, trying to keep my tone casual. He just shrugged and said it was probably the plumbing. He didn't look concerned at all. He told me not to worry, that these old buildings have all sorts of strange noises. Then he quickly changed the subject, asking if the toilet was flushing fine, if the stove worked. I said yes, and he walked away with an odd smile. I couldn't tell if he was amused or if he was brushing me off. Either way, I didn't get much comfort out of that conversation as the days went on. I noticed the muffled conversation started up more often. Sometimes I heard it when I was in the shower. Sometimes when I was cooking, it wasn't loud, but it was consistent enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. I tried hitting the walls with my fist, yelling for whoever it was to knock it off, but it would always go quiet. Right after I responded, I started to feel like something was watching me, even though I had no evidence of that. My skin would prickle whenever I walked down the hallway or when I was alone in the laundry room downstairs. Everything about the building made me uneasy. The metal elevator doors clanged shut behind me with this echo that sounded like a dull clang in a tunnel. The stairwell smelled like mold and old water. The trash chute in the corridor sometimes rattled for no reason. One afternoon, I decided to go up to the roof to check out the water tank. I had a flimsy reason. I wanted to see if maybe the water system was somehow creating those weird voices. I wasn't sure how that would even work, but I was desperate for a logical explanation. The only access to the roof was a narrow iron staircase at the end of the top floor hallway. The handle was rusty and it stuck. When I tried to turn it, I had to yank it hard. Finally, the door opened with a screech that made me grit my teeth. The wind outside hit my face as I stepped onto the roof. The sun was bright, but the air smelled stale like dust and old pigeons. The concrete roof was cracked in places, and I could see random bits of junk piled in corners. There was a broken chair, a few old crates, and a tar-stained bench. The water tank was in a fenced area near the far edge. I walked over to the fence. It was locked with a heavy chain, but the chain was so old it looked like it had rusted in place. I gave it a couple of tugs. It jangled but stayed locked. I peeked through the fence of the tank. It was a large metal cylinder with patches of rust around the edges. I could smell something sour, almost like stagnant water. It reminded me of a neglected basement or a puddle that never dried up that made me nervous. I wondered if it was safe to even drink the water in the building. I stayed there for a minute, breathing through my mouth to avoid the stench. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary except the water in the tank looked dark. I couldn't see inside clearly, just a surface that seemed filmy. I let go of the fence and decided I'd bring it up with the landlord again. That's when I heard of a soft sound behind me. I spun around. There was no one else on the roof. The door was still shut, and the wind had died down, so it wasn't a draft. The sound had been a faint scraping, like footsteps on gravel. My heart started pounding and my palms got sweaty. I waited, listening. I heard nothing else. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe a bird knocked something over or a piece of debris shifted. I tried not to think too hard about it because I already felt uneasy and I didn't want to push myself into panic. I walked back to the rooftop door, opened it, and headed down the stairs as calmly as I could. My legs felt shaky that evening. I was in my apartment staring at the ceiling, just trying to relax. I was replaying the events in my head, telling myself I was overreacting, but the building wasn't giving me a break. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard that conversation again, right through the bathroom wall. My chest tightened and I accidentally jabbed my toothbrush against my gums. I spat blood into the sink, rinsed my mouth, and leaned my head closer to the wall. It sounded like two people talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out words, just the rhythm of speech. My own heart was pounding so loud in my ears that it was hard to focus. I splashed water on my face, half expecting the voices to stop, but they didn't. They kept going like they were in the middle of an argument or a heated discussion. I put my hand on the wall. It felt cold under my palm. I stood there for a long moment, not sure what to do. Eventually, I walked out of the bathroom, turned off every light, except for a small lamp by the couch, and sat down to think. My mind was scrambling for a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone had managed to sneak into the apartment next door. Maybe it wasn't as vacant as I thought. That idea made me feel a bit better because it was something normal, someone squatting there. Or maybe the landlord had rented it out without telling me. Still, I didn't like the idea of strangers behind that wall. I decided to go check. I threw on a jacket and stepped into the hallway. I stood in front of the door to the adjacent apartment and knocked. My knuckles made a dull thud against the wood. I waited, hearing my own breaths echo nothing. No movement inside. I tried the knob, but it was locked. I banged on the door harder. Called out, "Hey, is anyone in there?" No answer. The hallway stayed silent except for the faint hum of the building's old electrical system. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I waited another minute, then gave up and went back into my apartment. I barely slept that night. Every small sound in the darkness made me bolt upright, my heart racing around 3 in the morning. I heard a faint scraping noise coming from the ceiling, like something shifting on the roof. I got up, paced around my living room, checked the hallway through the peephole. It was pitch black except for the glow from the exit sign. My mouth was dry and my hands shook whenever I tried to pick something up. I was exhausted and unsettled in the morning. I saw the landlord again and I told him about the voices and the strange odor by the water tank. He gave me a blank stare and said there was nothing to worry about, that the building was old and I was probably just on edge because I wasn't used to the place. I insisted that the odor seemed like something was rotting in the tank. He said he'd send someone to check it out, but I could tell by his disinterested tone that he wasn't going to rush. That night I heard the voices again. This time they lasted for nearly an hour, stopping. Only when I got too close to the wall my nerves were shot. My stomach was twisted in knots. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I felt trapped, like I needed to get out of that apartment, but I had nowhere else to go. I walked around my place, flicking lights on and off, opening closets, checking under the bed, hoping to find some explanation. But there was nothing, just the same peeling paint, the same squeaky floorboards, and the same silence that mocked me when the voices went away. I tried the roof again the next day, but the door was locked from the inside. This time, the landlord must have changed something or put a new lock on it. I didn't bother asking him about it because he already seemed annoyed with my questions that left me with no answers about the odor I'd smelled near the tank. At that point, I was convinced something was up there, something stagnant, but I couldn't prove it, and I had no idea if it had anything to do with the voices. My life became a cycle of dread. I'd come home from work, brace myself in the hallway, unlock my door, and immediately check if I heard anything. Most nights, the voices started sometime after midnight. I tried sleeping with music on, but I could still hear them under the sound. I tried earplugs, but they didn't fully block the muffled drone. I'd lie in bed, sweat gathering on my forehead, listening to my heart and waiting for the faint murmur to begin. One evening, I decided to just leave the apartment and sit in my car for a while, thinking, Maybe I needed fresh air, but in the parking lot, I realized I couldn't stay out there all night. I had nowhere else to go. I was stuck with that apartment, with that building. So I went back in, and sure enough, around 1 a.m., the wall started that same routine. I felt anger welling up inside me. I yelled, pounded on the walls, but it only made my throat hurt. My muscles were tense, and I could feel sweat pooling under my arms. I paced back and forth, cursing under my breath. I started to question my own sanity. Maybe I was sleep-deprived and imagining all of this. I don't have a neat conclusion to all of this. All I can say is after weeks of trying to live with it, the constant tension wore me down. I kept hearing those conversations that never made sense. I never discovered exactly what was causing it. The landlord kept dismissing it. The strange odor on the roof never went away, even though he claimed someone checked it, and every time I got close to the wall where the noises came from, they would stop. I'm still in that apartment, still trying to figure out why the building feels like it's hiding something every night. I wait, and every night it comes, that low, muffled, impossible conversation between the walls. I've learned to keep the lights on and try not to listen too hard, but it's difficult. I feel my body tense at the slightest sound. My jaw aches from grinding my teeth. My eyes burn from lack of sleep, and when the voice is finally quiet, I'm left with my own heartbeat and the knowledge that it's not over. Whatever's causing it, it's still there just on the other side of that old cracked wall, and every time I think about it, my stomach twists, my palms sweat, and I feel an urge to run out of this building and never come back. But for now, I have to stay. Even though I know this place isn't normal, so I just wait for the next night, wondering when I'll hear that strange conversation again and praying it doesn't get any closer than it already is. I never expected a routine afternoon at work to turn into the most unsettling experience I've had in years. I was just doing my job trying to fix a power issue that wouldn't stop bothering the main office. Nobody else seemed available, so I said I would check the basement. I felt confident at first. I've handled small electrical problems before, and it was usually a quick process. Flip a breaker, tighten a wire, and get out. But this time, every moment I spent down there only made me more tense. When I first opened the door to the basement, the hallway lights upstairs were bright enough to guide me. The stairs creaked under my feet. The air smelled stale, like no one had opened a window in ages. I took each step slowly because the overhead light in the stairwell was faint. The last few steps disappeared into darkness. I couldn't see the bottom of the staircase at all. My breath felt shallow, and I tried not to think about how quiet it was down there. I reached the concrete floor, and my shoes made a slight tapping sound. That noise felt too loud for my own comfort. I found a single overhead bulb near the electrical panel. It was flickering on and off. The breaker was right there inside a metal box on the wall. I walked over and flipped it for a moment. The flickering stopped. I heard the hum of the lights come back to life, and I thought I had fixed the problem, but within seconds there was a loud click and everything went black again. I stood still. Heart pounding, my fingers still on the breaker switch. I flipped it back to on, but it immediately clicked off. That was unusual. Usually a breaker only trips if there's a serious overload or a short circuit. I kept telling myself it was just an electrical fault. I cried again, no luck. I fumbled for the flashlight on my phone. The small beam cut through the darkness, but it also made everything feel strange. The dancing light created shadows on the walls, and the basement looked bigger than it was. The overhead bulb stayed off, and that left me with only my phone to guide me. A few old shelves and cabinets stood against the walls, stacked with forgotten office supplies and old cleaning products. The smell of dust and damp concrete became stronger, and I had to cover my nose for a moment. My pulse was racing, but I told myself it was just because I was frustrated with the breaker. I tried to stay calm. I checked the panel to see if there were any burnt wires or loose connections. My phone's light revealed some cables that looked worn, but nothing obviously charred. Then the breaker clicked back into place on its own. Lights flickered for 2 seconds. During those 2 seconds, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten on the far side of the basement past 2 big metal storage cabinets. I saw a shadow move. It didn't look like a reflection of my own body. It seemed separate, like someone else was standing behind the cabinets. I froze and watched as the light blinked off again. Darkness swallowed the space and I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded harder. I tried not to panic. I moved my phone light toward the cabinets. All I could see was dust on the floor and some old boxes nearby. I didn't hear footsteps, but I felt like someone was there. My hands were sweaty and I wiped them on my pants. I told myself maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. The basement was mostly silent, except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. I kept hoping someone would come down and ask me what was taking so long, but no one did. I decided to go back upstairs for a moment to see if I could reset the breaker from the main panel. In another part of the building, my legs felt shaky as I climbed the steps. The door at the top felt heavier than before, or maybe my nerves were making me weaker. When I got upstairs, I asked our maintenance guy if there was some other switch or fuse that might be affecting the basement. He told me the main switch for that section was indeed in a small closet near the supply room. I went to that closet, checked the panel there, and everything looked fine. Nothing tripped, no sign of an obvious short circuit. He said we might have a faulty breaker downstairs that needed replacement. He offered to come with me, but he got a call on his radio about a spill in another area. He sounded annoyed and said he had to handle that. First, I waited a few minutes for him, but then I realized it might take longer. I didn't want to waste more time, so I told him I would try again alone. I went back to the basement door as soon as I opened it. The smell of damp concrete hit my nose again. I held my breath for a moment, not wanting to inhale more dust. I used my phone's for flashlight to guide me down the stairs. My shoulders felt tense and my ears were on high alert. I heard my own heartbeat. Each step down made me more anxious. I reached the bottom and aimed my light toward the breaker box again. I tried flipping the breaker a few times. It stayed on for a moment, then tripped off. Each time the overhead bulb flickered for about 2 seconds. During one of those flickers, I saw movement behind the cabinets again. It was quick, like someone shifting from one side to the other. I heard a soft scrape as if a shoe slid on the concrete. I spun around, shining my phone light at the cabinets. Nothing I wanted to shout, "Who's there?" But I felt unsure about how smart that was. My mouth felt dry and my throat felt tight. I walked closer to those cabinets. My feet scuffed against the floor, kicking up a small puff of dust. My phone light trembled because my hand was shaking. I reached the edge of the cabinet and peeked around it. The backside led to another corner of the basement. I hadn't really paid attention to the walls. They were lined with old pipes and what looked like a few metal crates stacked on top of each other. The corner was dim even with my flashlight. I didn't see anyone. I only heard a drip coming from a pipe above. The dripping sound echoed in the silence. I was about to step into that corner when the breaker clicked again. The lights flickered, but then they died just as fast. I felt a wave of panic. I hurried back to the electrical panel. My mind raced. I thought maybe I should leave and wait for the maintenance guy, but the rational part of me wanted to fix the problem now without calling for backup. I also felt a strange urge to see if I could catch whoever was moving around. A part of me kept thinking maybe it was a coworker playing a prank. Our office sometimes had people who messed around like that, but the longer I stayed, the more uneasy I felt. I started examining the wires again, opening the panel, tugging gently on each connection. That's when I heard a quiet thud behind me. It sounded like something bumped against the cabinet. I whipped around with my flashlight. My pulse pounded in my ears. I moved toward the sound. Feeling my throat tighten again, I nudged the side of the cabinet with my foot. Checking if it was unsteady, it seemed solid. Another sound came from the corner, a soft rustling. I aimed my light there, but it only revealed old crates and pipes. My fingers twitched on my phone, ready to call someone. I decided to speak in a firm voice. "Hello, is anyone there?" My voice echoed. No answer, just that dripping pipe. My stomach was churning. My arms felt cold even though the air was stuffy. I wanted to leave, but I also felt stubborn. I didn't want to be the guy who got spooked by an old basement, so I walked back to the panel, forced the breaker into place again, and held it. The light stayed on while I held the switch. My phone light was off now, so the overhead bulb was my only source of illumination. It flickered a bit, but it stayed on. I glanced toward the cabinets. My eyes caught something shifting like an arm or a leg slipping behind the metal shelf. My chest heightened. I felt genuine fear. Then the breaker jerked under my finger and snapped off darkness again. I cursed under my breath. My phone light came back on, but my battery was getting low. I could see the icon flashing. I knew I only had a few minutes left before my phone died. That panicked me even more. I tried to remain calm. I pulled a small flashlight from my tool bag, one of those cheap ones with weak batteries. It was better than nothing. I switched it on. The beam was steadier than my phone light. At least I moved away from the breaker panel, deciding to search around the basement more thoroughly if someone was there. I wanted to know. I shone the flashlight under the old desks stacked in one corner. I kicked aside some empty boxes. I saw only cobwebs and dust. I walked along the back wall, checking behind each piece of stored furniture. One tall shelf was loaded with files from 10 years ago. Another shelf held broken chairs. I reached the corner with the dripping pipe and those metal crates. I leaned forward and aimed the flashlight between the crates. Nothing, no sign of movement, no sign of a person. The dripping water made a small puddle on the floor. The air felt colder. There I heard a noise near the stairs. It sounded like a light step. I quickly swung the flashlight in that direction. I caught a glimpse of a shape disappearing around the corner up the staircase. It happened in a split second. I couldn't make out details, just that. It was hum-sized. I felt a jolt of adrenaline. My muscles tensed. I broke into a run, aiming my flashlight ahead of me. The beam jumped across the steps, revealing the empty staircase. I climbed quickly. My breathing was loud in my own ears. The door at the top was closed, but not locked. I pushed it open. No one was in the hallway. I called out, "Hey," but didn't get a reply. I looked both ways and saw nobody. The corridor was silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. I paused there, trying to catch my breath. I glanced down at my phone. The battery was at 5%. I felt shaky. I walked to the supply room, hoping to find the maintenance guy, but he wasn't there. I grabbed an extra flashlight from the shelf, one with fresh batteries. Then I headed back down again. I didn't want to leave that basement with the breaker still failing. I also wanted to find out who was messing around. When I got back downstairs, the smell felt heavier and the silence seemed more oppressive. I switched on the new flashlight, letting the beam spread across the floor. I made my way to the panel. I flipped the breaker again. It clicked into place and the lights buzzed overhead. They stayed on for about 3 seconds in that brief time. I scanned the basement. I saw shadows across the walls. One moved near the cabinets, then darted behind them. I ran toward that spot. My shoes squeaked on the floor. The overhead light died again, but I kept going. Guided by my flashlight, I reached the cabinets. I swung the beam around. Nothing. The corner with the crates was empty. My hands were shaking now. My stomach twisted in knots. It felt like there was someone there always. One step ahead of me, I decided it wasn't safe to stay. Alone, I turned and hurried back up the stairs. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it echoed in my ears when I got to the top. I slammed the door behind me. I locked it. Then I went looking for my coworker again. I found him finishing up his cleaning job. I told him about the strange shadows and the breaker tripping on its own. He didn't seem too surprised. He said the basement wiring was old and he had heard other people mention seeing things down there before. He said we'd handle the breaker tomorrow with a better set of tools and maybe replace it entirely. I spent the rest of the day avoiding that basement. My clothes smelled musty and my skin felt clammy. I kept replaying the moments in my head, the flickering lights, the shadows behind the cabinets. The shape on the stairs. I tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation. Maybe another coworker, maybe some vagrant who found a way in, but it didn't sit right with me. The feeling of being watched was too real. I know I didn't imagine the footsteps or the soft scraping sounds. Later that evening, I closed up my desk, grabbed my jacket, and left the building without going near the basement again. My boss asked if the lights were fixed. I mumbled that I needed more time. I didn't want to admit that I ran out of there on the drive home. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a dark shape in the back seat. That was it. I never found out what was really down there. I keep telling myself I'll go back and solve the electrical problem once and for all, but every time I remember those shadows moving in the dim light, I feel a chill. It's just a basement. It's just an old electrical system, but something was there. I felt it, and next time I won't go down alone for